Imagine a time when Europe was fragmented into small, warring kingdoms. A time when the very idea of a united empire seemed impossible, and the concept of Europe was just a dream. Yet, in the year 800 CE, one man, Charles the Great, later known as Charlemagne, would rise to change that. Charlemagne's reign would not only shape the future of France, but also transform the entire continent. He didn't just rule, he reshaped the world around him, leaving a legacy that would echo for centuries. Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Romans by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day, 800, in a ceremony that would become one of the most iconic moments in medieval history. This event marked the revival of the idea of a Holy Roman Empire, a title that had once belonged to the mighty Roman emperors but had long since been lost. For Charlemagne, this crowning was not just a title. It was a symbol of his ambition to unite a fractured Europe under one rule, one faith. Under Charlemagne, the Carolingian Empire reached its height, stretching across modern-day France, Germany, and parts of Italy. His empire was an alliance between the Frankish kingdom and the Christian church, creating a foundation that would lead to the rise of the medieval European monarchy. But it wasn't just about expansion. Charlemagne understood the importance of culture, education, and the rule of law. He reformed the legal system, set up a network of local leaders called counts, and even established a school at his court in Aachen, where scholars from all over Europe gathered to preserve ancient texts and promote learning. This was the dawn of the Carolingian Renaissance, a revival of knowledge that would lay the groundwork for the intellectual flourishing of the later Middle Ages. As Charlemagne's empire expanded, so too did his influence over European politics and culture. His leadership wasn't just about military conquests or territorial expansion. It was about creating a unified Christian empire that would serve as a model for the future. Charlemagne knew that without the support of the church, his rule would never be solidified. It was through his close relationship with the Pope that he was able to strengthen his power and establish the legitimacy of his reign. But Charlemagne's empire wasn't just an empire of conquest. It was an empire of reform. Charlemagne worked tirelessly to improve the governance of his vast territories, something that had been lacking in earlier times. He understood that a united empire required a solid administrative framework, and so he sent out his missi dominici, royal agents, to monitor local rulers, ensure justice, and uphold his law throughout the empire. These agents were Charlemagne's eyes and ears, ensuring that his rule was enforced at every level. Perhaps Charlemagne's greatest achievement was his cultural impact. Charlemagne was a passionate supporter of education and the preservation of knowledge. Under his rule, the Carolingian Renaissance began to take shape, with scholars, poets, and historians flocking to his court. Charlemagne believed in the power of education to strengthen his empire, and so he encouraged the establishment of schools and monasteries where learning could flourish. He was also instrumental in reviving the Latin language as the lingua franca of the empire, helping to preserve the classical knowledge of ancient Rome. In doing so, Charlemagne laid the intellectual foundation for the Middle Ages. His reign was, in many ways, the first step toward the medieval Renaissance, a time when Europe would rise from the chaos of the Dark Ages into a period of intellectual, cultural, and political growth. As Charlemagne's empire eventually fragmented, the dream of a unified European realm seemed to fade. But the seeds planted during his reign would grow into something significant in France. In the year 987, Hugh Capet was crowned King of France, marking the beginning of the Capetian dynasty, a line that would rule for over 800 years. Unlike Charlemagne's vast empire, the Capetians initially held only a small portion of land, centered around Paris, but their rise would signal the gradual consolidation of power that would define the future of France. The Capetians were not military giants or conquerors. Rather, they were strategic politicians. Hugh Capet and his successors knew that stability came not through war, but through careful alliances, inheritance, and diplomacy. Over time, they expanded their power, steadily gaining control of more land and consolidating their influence over the fragmented nobility of France. It was a slow, steady process that turned the Capetian monarchy into a force to be reckoned with. While the early Capetian kings might not have had the military strength of Charlemagne, they were masterful governors, able to maintain peace and order in a fractured kingdom. The early monarchs of the Capetian line built a strong administrative framework, using their influence over local lords to assert control. They also relied heavily on the support of the church, which helped cement their legitimacy, just as Charlemagne had done centuries earlier. However, the most significant of the Capetian monarchs was perhaps Louis IX, known as St. Louis. His reign from 1226 to 1270 marked a high point in the power of the monarchy. Louis IX was a deeply religious man who saw his role as a divine mission, and under his rule, France experienced both political stability and cultural flourishing. He was a fair and just ruler, dedicated to law and order, and his piety helped enhance the monarchy's image, establishing it as the protector of Christian faith in Europe. By the time the 17th century dawned, France was ready for a transformation. The monarchy, though stronger than ever before, still had its struggles with internal conflict and external threats. Enter Louis XIV, the king who would reshape not only France, but the entire concept of monarchy. Louis, often called the Sun King, reigned for an extraordinary 72 years, from 1643 to 1715, making him the longest reigning monarch in European history. His reign marked the true emergence of absolute monarchy, where the king's word was law, and his control over the state was absolute. Louis XIV's vision of a unified, centralized France would become the hallmark of his rule. Unlike his predecessors, who ruled with the help of nobles, Louis saw them as a threat to his power. His solution? Versailles. In 1682, Louis XIV moved his court to the lavish palace of Versailles, a magnificent symbol of royal power and the heart of France's political and cultural life. This palace wasn't just a home, it was a tool to control the nobility. By moving the court to Versailles, Louis XIV ensured that the most powerful nobles would be at his mercy, dependent on his favor for wealth and influence. The grandeur of Versailles reflected Louis's belief that the monarchy was a divine institution. The Sun King saw himself as the center of everything, with all power revolving around him, just as the sun is the center of our solar system. This philosophy, known as l'état, c'est moi, I am the state, captured the essence of Louis's reign. The king was not just a ruler, but a living symbol of the nation's unity and strength. Under his rule, France enjoyed a period of great cultural, artistic, and military achievements. He established a strong bureaucratic state that allowed him to control every aspect of French life, from taxes to the military to cultural production. However, this came at cost. Louis's military campaigns, particularly in the War of Spanish Succession, drained the royal coffers and created tensions within the country. Louis XIV's reign would leave a lasting legacy. He built an empire that was powerful, but also set the stage for future conflicts. His centralized monarchy would later inspire the rise of absolutism across Europe, but it also sowed the seeds for the discontent that would eventually lead to the French Revolution. By the time of Louis XIV's reign, France had developed a deeply entrenched social structure known as the Ancien Regime, which would dominate the country for centuries. This system divided society into three main estates, each with its own privileges and responsibilities. The first estate was the clergy, the second estate was the nobility, and the third estate was everyone else, peasants, workers, and the growing middle class. The first estate, comprising the clergy, held significant power, controlling not only the religious life of France, but also much of its wealth. The church was deeply intertwined with the monarchy, both influencing and being influenced by the royal family. Members of the clergy enjoyed numerous privileges, including exemption from taxes and control over vast amounts of land. Their influence permeated every corner of French society, from the education system to the administration of justice. The second estate, the nobility, was equally privileged but more complex. While they were exempt from many taxes, they held great power over land and local politics. However, this power often came at a price. The nobility were expected to live lavishly, to support the monarch, and to be ready for military service when called upon. Louis XIV, ever the strategist, knew that keeping the nobility at Versailles would ensure their dependence on his favor and help centralize his authority. But despite their privileges, the nobility faced growing dissatisfaction. Many were in debt due to their extravagant lifestyles, and their influence was being eroded by Louis's centralized bureaucracy. Then, there was the Third Estate, the vast majority of the population. This group included everyone from the poorest peasants, struggling to survive on the land, to the more affluent members of the growing middle class. The peasants, often working the land of the nobility, faced crushing poverty and were burdened with heavy taxes. They were, in many ways, the backbone of French society, but they had little to no political power. The middle class, or bourgeoisie, on the other hand, was starting to grow in influence. They were wealthy and educated but lacked the same privileges as the nobility, fueling discontent. This rigid social hierarchy created a society steeped in inequality. The vast gulf between the rich and the poor became more pronounced as France faced economic challenges. By the time the 18th century rolled around, the seeds of revolution were being sown. Enlightenment thinkers, many of them part of the bourgeoisie, began to challenge the legitimacy of the monarchy and the entire social structure. They argued that reason, not birthright, should determine one's position in society, and that all men were born with equal rights. As the Ancien regime continued to dominate French society, the growing sense of inequality began to stir deep discontent, particularly among the Third Estate, the vast majority of France's population. The stark contrast between the lavish lifestyles of the nobility and clergy and the crushing poverty faced by peasants was impossible to ignore. Yet, it wasn't just the material disparity that bothered the people. It was the lack of political power and the rigidity of the social structure that kept them in their place. As France entered the 18th century, the seeds of change were already being planted by Enlightenment thinkers, whose ideas would challenge the very foundations of the Ancien regime. The Enlightenment, a period of intellectual revolution, brought forth radical ideas that questioned traditional authority and emphasized reason, individual rights, and equality. Thinkers like Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu began to critique the absolute power of monarchs and the unfair treatment of the common people. One of the most influential Enlightenment ideas came from Jean-Jacques Rousseau, whose work, The Social Contract, argued that legitimate political authority rests not on the divine right of kings, but on a contract between the rulers and the ruled. Rousseau's belief in popular sovereignty, that the people, not a monarch, should hold ultimate power, began to resonate with the bourgeoisie and the peasants alike. These ideas would later be fundamental in shaping the ideals of the French Revolution. In parallel, Voltaire critiqued the Church's influence over the state, and Montesquieu championed the separation of powers in government. These Enlightenment thinkers painted a vision of a society where people were treated equally, where laws were just, and where individual freedoms were protected. Their ideas spread across France, inspiring a new generation of educated citizens who began to question the old order. The Third Estate, comprising peasants, artisans, and the growing middle class, began to see these intellectual movements as an antidote to their suffering. The bourgeoisie, in particular, were beginning to accumulate wealth through commerce and industry, yet they had no political power to match their growing influence. These educated, affluent individuals found common ground with the poorer classes who were enduring the unbearable taxes, hunger, and lack of representation. The cry for liberty, equality, and fraternity was starting to echo throughout French society. By the time the French Revolution erupted in 1789, the old system of monarchy and feudal privileges seemed increasingly unjust, and Enlightenment ideas had laid the intellectual groundwork for what was to come. As the 18th century wore on, the tension between the monarchy and the people of France grew harder to ignore. The vast majority of the population, the Third Estate, was burdened with both heavy taxes and a lack of political representation. Meanwhile, the nobility and clergy, the first two estates, lived in unparalleled luxury, exempt from taxes and enjoying vast privileges. This inequality wasn't just felt by the peasants, but also by the emerging bourgeoisie, the middle class who were educated, wealthy, and influential in business, but had little to no political power. The financial strain on France was enormous. France's involvement in wars, particularly the American Revolution, drained the royal treasury, leaving the monarchy deeply in debt. King Louis XVI, though well-meaning, struggled to reform the system. His inability to effectively address the financial crisis further alienated the people. The nobility, who had long enjoyed privileges and exemptions, refused to pay taxes, and this resistance left the French government crippled. With mounting debt, famine, and rising unemployment, the common people could take no more. Enter the Enlightenment thinkers, who, through their works, inspired many to question the old regime. The growing intellectual movement spread like wildfire, challenging everything the monarchy stood for. Voltaire, Rousseau, and Montesquieu offered radical ideas of equality and justice that resonated with those seeking change. These ideas didn't just talk about government. They offered a vision of a world where power was decentralized, where everyone was treated equally, and where the monarch's absolute authority was challenged. It was during these years of intellectual ferment that the First Estate, the clergy, and the Second Estate, the nobility, began to see their privileges threatened. However, they were not yet ready to give up their wealth and power. The Third Estate, now fueled by Enlightenment ideals and the reality of their suffering, began to demand their rightful place in the political system. The stage was set for an explosive change. At the same time, economic crises worsened, as poor harvests and famine swept across the country. The price of bread skyrocketed, and the peasants, already struggling to survive, became more desperate. The bourgeoisie, inspired by the ideas of liberty and equality, began to call for the reform of the system, while the peasants' anger boiled over. It became clear that France was on the brink of revolution. The tension in France had reached a boiling point. The Ancien regime, with its outdated social structure and deeply entrenched inequalities, could no longer hold sway over the people. The monarchy, still clinging to its privileges, seemed increasingly out of touch with the suffering of the common people. And it was not just the Third Estate, peasants, workers, and the bourgeoisie, who felt this growing unrest. Even members of the Second Estate, the nobility, began to see that the system was unsustainable. However, their motives differed. The nobility sought to preserve their influence within a reformed system, while the common people called for more radical changes. The year 1789 would prove to be the turning point. France was in the midst of financial crisis, with the monarchy unable to balance the books and unable to push through meaningful reforms. Amid rising food prices, widespread hunger, and widespread dissatisfaction, King Louis XVI called for the Estates General, a meeting of representatives from the three estates, to discuss ways to resolve the financial crisis. Little did he know that this would be the spark that ignited the French Revolution. The Third Estate, frustrated with their lack of political power, quickly took matters into their own hands. They declared themselves the National Assembly, believing that they, as the true representation of the people, should have the power to make decisions for the future of France. They were determined to challenge the monarchy and the outdated system. Their actions led to one of the most iconic moments of the Revolution, the storming of the Bastille. On July 14, 1789, the people of Paris, fueled by anger and desperation, stormed the Bastille, a symbol of royal tyranny and oppression. The fall of the Bastille was more than just the collapse of a prison. It was the collapse of the old regime. It signified the beginning of the revolution, as the people took up arms against the monarchy and its unjust system. The National Assembly set to work immediately, drafting the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen, which proclaimed that all men were born free and equal in rights. This was a bold statement against the monarchy and the aristocracy, declaring that the power of the state rested in the hands of the people. As the revolution spread throughout France, so too did the idea of equality, liberty, and fraternity, the rallying cry of the revolutionaries. The Ancien regime was in its final days, and the monarchy's grip on France was beginning to slip away. The revolution had begun, and France would never be the same again. On the morning of July 14, 1789, Paris was a city on edge. The political climate was charged, the streets buzzed with tension, and the common people of France had finally had enough. For years, they had endured poverty, hunger, and oppression under the Ancien regime, the rigid system that favored the monarchy and the elite. The air was thick with anger and desperation, and the storming of the Bastille would become the symbolic moment that sparked the French Revolution, forever changing the course of history. The Bastille, a massive fortress located in the heart of Paris, had long been a symbol of royal oppression. Originally built as a medieval prison, it had become a place where political prisoners were held without trial, and it represented the absolute power of the monarchy. Its walls were a stark reminder of the inequality and injustice that had plagued France for centuries. Though the prison only held 7 prisoners at the time of the storming, its fall was about much more than freeing those individuals. It was about the people of France reclaiming their power. The French economy was in tatters. Grain prices had soared, and bread, the staple of the French diet, was increasingly scarce. Many people were starving, and they saw no end to their suffering. Meanwhile, King Louis XVI had been unable to solve the financial crisis, and the nobility and clergy continued to enjoy their privileges. The Third Estate, composed of peasants, workers, and the growing bourgeoisie, felt completely ignored by the monarchy. Their cries for equality and justice went unheard. As tensions escalated, the people of Paris grew more radical. They took to the streets, and a group of revolutionaries decided to target the Bastille, believing it symbolized the monarchy's tyranny. The city's city hall, the Hôtel de Ville, had already been seized by revolutionaries, and now the Bastille was their next target. Armed with a mix of makeshift weapons, the people stormed the fortress, demanding the release of the prisoners and the gunpowder stored inside. The battle was fierce, but after several hours of fighting, the Bastille finally fell. The prison governor, Bernardin de Launay, was captured and brutally killed by the mob, marking a bloody beginning to the revolution. The people of Paris had struck a blow against the monarchy, and their victory was not just symbolic. It was the first real sign that the Ancien Regime was on the brink of collapse. The storming of the Bastille was a turning point. It was the moment when the people of France, tired of their suffering, took action. It was the spark that ignited the French Revolution, and in that moment, a new era of political and social change began. For the revolutionaries, it wasn't just about taking a fortress. It was about taking back their country and their freedom. In the wake of the storming of the Bastille, the mood in Paris was electrified. The people, emboldened by their victory, believed that they had started something far greater than just the fall of a prison. They had begun a revolution that would shake the very foundations of French society. Now, with the Bastille in their hands, they needed to define what this revolution was about. The answer came soon after, in a document that would change the course of history, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Adopted by the National Assembly on August 26, 1789, the Declaration was revolutionary in every sense. It was a bold proclamation of human rights, liberty, and equality, challenging centuries of monarchy, feudalism, and the rigid class structures of the Ancien Regime. The Declaration was inspired by the Enlightenment thinkers whose ideas had already begun to challenge the legitimacy of absolute monarchy. Philosophers like John Locke, Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and Voltaire had long advocated for a system in which individual rights were paramount and the government existed to serve the people. In its opening lines, the Declaration declared that men are born and remain free and equal in rights. This powerful statement immediately struck at the heart of the old regime, where monarchs ruled by divine right and the people had no voice. The document further outlined specific rights for citizens, including freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and the right to participate in the creation of laws. It also declared that sovereignty rested not in the monarchy, but in the people. This was a radical shift from centuries of absolute monarchy. However, the Declaration was not just about rights. It was also about justice. It argued that laws should be made by the people for the people, and that those laws should be based on reason, not the whim of a king. This was the first serious effort in French history to move toward a democratic system of government. It was an ambitious blueprint for a new kind of France, one in which people could shape their own destinies rather than having them dictated by an all-powerful monarch. Yet, despite the eloquent principles enshrined in the Declaration, the revolution was far from over. The ideas it espoused would be tested in the coming years, as revolutionaries would struggle to define what liberty, equality, and fraternity meant in practice. As the revolution unfolded, it became clear that the fight for freedom would be more complex and bloody than anyone had anticipated. But the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the citizen provided a foundation upon which the revolutionaries could build. It was a statement of what could be, a vision of a new France, and it set the tone for the struggles that lay ahead. As the revolution progressed, the changes sweeping through France became increasingly radical. What began as a struggle for reform was now evolving into something far more profound: the complete overthrow of the monarchy. The execution of Louis XVI on January 21st, 1793, marked the official end of the French monarchy and one of the most dramatic moments in the history of the Revolution. Louis XVI, once seen as the divine ruler of France, was now a prisoner of the revolutionaries. His inability to effectively address the nation's crises had contributed to his downfall, but it was his resistance to the growing demands for change that sealed his fate. Throughout 1792, political pressure continued to mount. The French were at war with several European monarchies, who feared the spread of revolutionary ideas, and the economic situation remained dire. Meanwhile, the radicals in the National Convention had grown bolder in their calls for the abolition of the monarchy. Louis's attempts to flee Paris during the flight to Varennes in June 1791 had already made him an enemy of the revolution. When the royal family was caught and brought back to Paris, it became clear that the monarchy could no longer survive in its traditional form. The National Convention abolished the monarchy and declared France a republic on September 21st, 1792. The trial of Louis XVI began shortly afterward. The charges against him were serious. He was accused of treason, having conspired with foreign monarchies to overthrow the revolution. Despite his pleas for mercy and his arguments that he was a constitutional monarch, Louis was found guilty of attempting to undermine the republic and plotting to restore absolute rule. His fate was sealed. On the morning of January 21st, 1793, a somber crowd gathered at the Place de la Révolution in Paris, where a scaffold had been erected for the king's execution. Louis, dressed in a simple black coat, was led to the guillotine. He addressed the crowd, declaring, "I die innocent of all the charges they have made against me." His words, however, did little to sway public opinion. As the blade of the guillotine fell, the monarchy's 1,000-year reign came to a brutal and final end. The execution was a profound symbol of the revolution's triumph over the ancient order, but it was also a turning point that marked the revolution's deepening radicalization. The end of Louis XVI did not bring the peace that many had hoped for. Instead, it marked the beginning of the Reign of Terror, a period where revolutionaries turned on one another in a frantic and often violent effort to protect the revolution from internal and external enemies. The death of Louis XVI was not just the end of a king, it was the end of an era. It signified the fall of the Ancien regime and the complete rejection of the old system. France, for the first time in centuries, was a nation without a king, and the French people now faced the enormous challenge of defining what a republic would look like and what they were willing to sacrifice to achieve it. After the execution of Louis XVI, the revolution entered a period of intense political upheaval. The National Convention, now tasked with overseeing the republic, was deeply divided. Within this tumultuous environment, one man would rise to prominence, only to fall in spectacular fashion. That man was Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of the Reign of Terror, whose rise to power would demonstrate both the revolutionary zeal and the perilous extremes to which the revolution would go. Robespierre, a former lawyer, had been a key figure in the Committee of Public Safety, which was established to protect the revolution from internal and external enemies. Known for his unwavering commitment to the ideals of the revolution, Robespierre believed that in order to secure liberty and equality, the revolutionaries had to purge France of corruption and opposition. To him, those who stood against the revolution were enemies of the people, and they had to be eliminated. His vision of a virtuous republic justified the violent measures that would soon define his reign. Under Robespierre's leadership, the revolution began to take a darker turn. The Reign of Terror, lasting from September 1793 to July 1794, was a period of intense political repression. The Committee of Public Safety, under Robespierre's command, became a ruthless enforcer of revolutionary ideals. The guillotine became a symbol of revolutionary justice, with thousands of suspected counter-revolutionaries, traitors, and even revolutionaries themselves being executed. In cities and towns across France, the terror spread like wildfire, with the government ordering arrests and executions for anyone deemed disloyal. The law of suspects passed in September 1793 expanded the definition of a suspect to include anyone who wasn't actively supporting the revolution. Soon, even former allies of the revolution found themselves on trial for their lives. Among the most notable victims of the terror were former revolutionaries like Georges Danton and Camille Desmoulins, who were executed for daring to criticize Robespierre's methods. Robespierre justified these actions with his belief in the virtue of terror. He argued that the use of extreme measures was necessary to protect the Republic and to force the French people to embrace the ideals of revolutionary virtue. He saw himself as the moral leader of the revolution, guided by the will of the people and the ideals of justice. However, as Robespierre's power grew, so did his paranoia. He began to target anyone who might stand in his way, even within the revolutionary government. His growing list of enemies made him increasingly isolated. In the summer of 1794, the political climate began to shift. Robespierre's extreme measures alienated many former supporters, and even members of his own party began to fear for their lives. On July 27, 1794, Robespierre's enemies in the National Convention moved against him. Accused of tyranny and dictatorial rule, Robespierre was arrested and sent to the guillotine the very next day. His death marked the end of the reign of terror and the beginning of a new phase of the revolution, one where more moderate voices would begin to take center stage. Robespierre's fall was a tragic irony. The man who had once been the fiercest defender of revolutionary ideals had become the very thing he sought to destroy, a tyrant. His death symbolized the dangers of extremism in revolution, how even the most virtuous of causes can be corrupted when taken to their violent extremes. The fall of Robespierre marked the end of one of the bloodiest chapters of the French Revolution, but it did not signal the end of the upheaval. In fact, it was a pivotal moment that marked the beginning of a new phase in the revolution, one where the First Republic would begin to take shape, and France would confront the challenge of creating a new political system free from the monarchy's centuries-old grip. After Robespierre's execution in July 1794, the National Convention took steps to restore stability to France. The Thermidorian reaction, named after the month in the revolutionary calendar during which Robespierre was overthrown, led to the dismantling of the revolutionary government that had perpetrated the reign of terror. Moderates in the convention, eager to distance themselves from the excesses of the past, began to push for a more stable and less radical France. Yet, despite the desire for stability, the revolutionaries still faced immense challenges. France was embroiled in war with much of Europe, economic conditions remained dire, and the people were still deeply dissatisfied with the lack of progress. It became clear that simply removing the terror wasn't enough to create lasting peace or prosperity. The First Republic, which had been declared in September 1792, just months before Louis XVI's execution, had yet to fully establish its legitimacy or its authority. It was a time of constant flux, as the revolutionaries continued to experiment with different forms of government. The National Convention remained in control, but it was clear that something needed to change if France were to avoid complete collapse. One of the key developments during this period was the drafting of the Constitution of 1795, which sought to create a more balanced government. This constitution established the Directory, a five-man executive body that would govern France, and it created a system of legislative assemblies. The idea was to provide a government that was more stable and less prone to radical extremes. However, the Directory was a deeply flawed system, rife with corruption and internal strife. While it was an improvement over the chaotic rule of Robespierre, it did little to address the broader social and economic issues plaguing France. Amid this instability, the people of France were still hungry for change. Discontent with the Directory grew, and in 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte, a brilliant military leader who had become a national hero during the wars of the Revolution, took advantage of the situation. In a bold coup, he overthrew the Directory and eventually established himself as the ruler of France, ending the chaotic experiment of the First Republic and paving the way for his rise to power as emperor. The formation of the First Republic was a significant moment in French history, as it marked the official end of the monarchy and the beginning of a republican system of government. Yet, its eventual failure highlighted the challenges of implementing democracy in a society that had been ruled by kings for so long. While the republic would not last, its ideals, liberty, equality, and fraternity, would continue to shape France and the world for generations to come. By 1799, France was teetering on the edge of collapse. The Directory, which had been created to restore order and stability after the chaos of the Reign of Terror, had become synonymous with corruption, inefficiency, and economic crisis. The people were weary of constant instability, and the revolutionary fervor that had once burned so brightly seemed to be fading. But in the midst of this turmoil, a man emerged who would forever change the course of French and world history: Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon's rise was a product of both his remarkable military genius and the political vacuum left by the Revolution. Born on the island of Corsica in 1769, Napoleon was a young officer in the French army when the Revolution began. His early career was marked by a series of stunning military victories that earned him a reputation as one of the most talented commanders in Europe. As France battled external enemies and internal dissent, Napoleon's ability to win battles and outthink his opponents made him a national hero. By 1799, Napoleon was already a powerful figure, and his popularity was growing rapidly. At the time, France was still engaged in wars with various European coalitions, and the French Revolution was in its final stages. The political system, under the Directory, was failing to meet the challenges of the moment. Economic hardship, social unrest, and the fear of foreign invasion left the country vulnerable. It was in this volatile environment that Napoleon saw an opportunity to act. In November 1799, Napoleon staged a coup d'état, overthrowing the Directory and replacing it with the consulate, a new form of government. Napoleon positioned himself as the first consul, effectively becoming the leader of France. While he initially promised to uphold the ideals of the Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, it quickly became clear that Napoleon's vision was one of centralized power and authoritarian rule. Despite this, he enjoyed widespread support from the French people, who were tired of the chaos and longed for stability and strong leadership. Napoleon's rise marked the end of the French Revolution in its original form. The revolution had begun with a call for liberty and the end of monarchy, but it had led to instability and internal violence. Napoleon, in contrast, offered the French people order, victory, and the promise of greatness. His coup effectively put an end to the ideals of republican democracy and replaced them with the rise of a military dictatorship. Yet, Napoleon's rule also marked the beginning of the Napoleonic Empire, which would go on to reshape Europe and the world. Though he began his reign as a revolutionary hero, Napoleon would soon betray the very principles that had fueled the revolution. Under his leadership, France would return to a monarchical system, albeit under the guise of an emperor. But even as he consolidated his power, Napoleon would also enact several key reforms that would leave a lasting legacy on France and the world, including the creation of the Napoleonic Code, a new legal framework that would influence legal systems worldwide. Napoleon's rise to power was a dramatic end to the French Revolution. What began as a struggle for freedom and equality would end in the establishment of an empire under a single ruler. The ideals of the revolution were not entirely lost, but they were reshaped in ways that no one could have predicted when the revolution began. Napoleon would go on to become one of history's most iconic and controversial figures, and his legacy would continue to haunt Europe long after his downfall. With Napoleon now firmly in control, the sweeping changes that began with the French Revolution took on a new form under his rule. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity, once the rallying cry of revolutionaries, now had to be transformed into a functioning government. Napoleon, though a product of the revolution, recognized that the true consolidation of power required a balance between the revolution's ideals and the absolute control he sought to establish. One of Napoleon's most lasting achievements was the creation of the Napoleonic Code, a legal system that would influence the world long after his reign. Implemented in 1804, the code was revolutionary in its attempt to standardize laws across France, abolishing feudal privileges and ensuring equality before the law for all male citizens. It was a clear break from the Ancien regime, where privileges were granted based on birthright rather than merit. The Napoleonic Code was built on the principles of the Revolution: equality, freedom of religion, and property rights. It solidified the gains of the Revolution by granting legal rights to individuals, and it helped to stabilize the legal system in post-revolutionary France. However, it also created a more centralized state, with Napoleon at the top as its absolute ruler. The code enshrined Napoleon's vision of a society where order, discipline, and control were paramount. Beyond the legal reforms, Napoleon set about building a Napoleonic empire that would rival the greatest empires of history. In 1804, Napoleon crowned himself Emperor of the French in a lavish ceremony that symbolized both the end of the French Republic and the rise of a new imperial era. He made sure that his reign was both regal and revolutionary, glorifying the monarchy while maintaining some of the reforms and ideals of the Revolution. Napoleon understood the importance of appearing to embrace the Revolution's legacy, even as he established a new system of imperial rule. Under Napoleon, France expanded dramatically. Through a series of military conquests, Napoleon built an empire that stretched from the Iberian Peninsula to the Russian frontier. His military genius and relentless ambition saw him lead France into battles that would reshape the map of Europe. The Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, where Napoleon decisively defeated the Russian and Austrian armies, is often considered one of the greatest military victories in history. However, as Napoleon's empire expanded, so did his challenges. While the Napoleonic Code ensured stability within his empire, the continual wars and the harsh continental system, which sought to cripple Britain economically, began to put a strain on France and its allies. Despite his brilliant victories on the battlefield, Napoleon's empire was built on a fragile foundation. The economic toll of constant war and the resentment of occupied peoples began to undermine his rule. Napoleon's empire also brought with it a new cultural and political order. His legal reforms, the Napoleonic Code, the spread of French culture, and the establishment of satellite states across Europe left a lasting legacy. Napoleon's influence on the legal systems, administrative structures, and even military tactics would resonate for generations, shaping the future of Europe. The Napoleonic Empire, for all its glory, was a reflection of Napoleon's belief in the strength of the state over the individual. His vision for a united Europe under French rule would ultimately meet its downfall, but the impact of his reforms, especially the Napoleonic Code, would reverberate across the world, making him one of the most significant figures in the history of both France and the modern world. By 1812, Napoleon's empire seemed invincible. His military genius had led France to dominate most of Europe, and his Napoleonic Code had reshaped the legal landscape of the continent. However, as with all great empires, the seeds of Napoleon's downfall were already sown, and they would come from the Russian disaster and the subsequent Battle of Leipzig, events that would mark the beginning of the end for the once mighty emperor. In 1812, Napoleon made the fateful decision to invade Russia, one of the few major powers still resisting his dominance. His ambition to bring Russia into the fold of the continental system, a trade blockade aimed at crippling Britain, led to the Russian campaign, one of the most disastrous military endeavors in history. The decision to invade was partly based on Napoleon's desire to crush any remaining opposition to his empire and to force Tsar Alexander I to comply with his economic blockade. Napoleon gathered one of the largest armies ever assembled in history, over 600,000 men, known as the Grand Army. However, this massive force faced a host of challenges from the very start. The Russian strategy was simple yet effective: scorched earth. As the Grand Army advanced, the Russians retreated further into the vast Russian landscape, burning villages, crops, and resources along the way, leaving Napoleon's army with nothing to sustain itself. This tactic, combined with the brutal Russian winter, devastated the French forces. When Napoleon finally reached Moscow in September 1812, he expected the Russian Tsar to negotiate a peace. Instead, the city was abandoned, and much of it was set on fire by the retreating Russians. With no supplies and facing the harsh Russian winter, Napoleon was forced to begin a retreat. The once proud Grand Army was decimated by starvation, disease, and constant attacks from Russian forces. By the time Napoleon abandoned the campaign, fewer than 100,000 men remained of the original army. This crushing defeat in Russia was a turning point for Napoleon. It shattered his image as an invincible leader and severely weakened his military power. But the Russian disaster was only the beginning of his troubles. In 1813, the Sixth Coalition, an alliance of Britain, Russia, Prussia, Spain, and several other countries, took advantage of Napoleon's weakened position. In October 1813, Napoleon faced the combined forces of the coalition at the Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations. The battle was a decisive defeat for Napoleon, and it marked the beginning of the end of his reign. Napoleon's army, exhausted from years of war, was overwhelmed by the superior numbers and coordination of the Allied forces. The loss at Leipzig left Napoleon with no choice but to retreat back to France, where his enemies quickly gained ground. The Sixth Coalition would soon march into France, and in 1814, after a series of defeats, Napoleon was forced to abdicate and was exiled to the island of Elba. The fall of Napoleon was a stunning reversal of fortune. From the heights of power and glory, he was reduced to a prisoner, exiled on a small island in the Mediterranean. The Russian campaign and the Battle of Leipzig had exposed the vulnerabilities of his empire, and the world would soon witness the end of the Napoleonic era. Napoleon Bonaparte's journey from a young boy on a small Mediterranean island to the ruler of a vast European empire is a story marked by ambition, intelligence, and a relentless drive for power. Born in 1769 on the island of Corsica, Napoleon came from a modest, yet noble family. His parents, Carlo Bonaparte and Letizia Remolino, were of Italian descent and had ties to the Corsican nobility, though their family was far from wealthy. Corsica itself had been recently acquired by France, and this complicated Napoleon's identity. Though he was born a French citizen, he grew up in an environment where the island's strong sense of independence and resentment towards French rule shaped his early years. From a young age, Napoleon demonstrated a keen intellect and a fierce determination to succeed. At the age of 9, he was sent to mainland France to pursue an education. His early schooling took him to the military academy at Brienne-le-Château, where he trained to become an officer in the French army. The transition from Corsica to France was difficult for Napoleon. He was isolated, often ridiculed for his Corsican accent, and struggled to fit in with his French peers. Yet, these challenges only fueled his ambition. Napoleon became determined to prove himself, focusing on his studies, especially in mathematics and military strategy. At the age of 16, Napoleon graduated from the Royal Military School in Paris and was commissioned as a second lieutenant in the artillery. It was at this point that Napoleon began to fully embrace his destiny as a military leader. He knew that the key to his future lay in the army, and he was willing to work relentlessly to climb the ranks. Napoleon's early military career was shaped by the backdrop of the French Revolution, a time when France was torn apart by political chaos and war. The revolution created an environment where talented officers, regardless of their background, had the chance to rise based on merit rather than birthright. By 1793, at the age of 24, Napoleon's military career took a decisive turn. He played a pivotal role in the Siege of Toulon, a French naval base occupied by British forces. His brilliant tactics led to the recapture of the city, and his success caught the attention of the revolutionary government. It was here that Napoleon began to gain recognition as a gifted strategist and leader, setting the stage for his rise in the chaotic world of revolutionary France. After his success in the Siege of Toulon in 1793, Napoleon's reputation as a brilliant military strategist began to spread. His decisive action in the battle earned him the admiration of key figures within the French Revolution, most notably Paul Barras, one of the leading members of the Directory, the government that ruled France after the monarchy's fall. At just 24, Napoleon was promoted to brigadier general, a remarkable achievement for someone so young, and he quickly rose through the ranks of the French military. Despite his success in Toulon, Napoleon's life was far from secure. The revolutionary government was embroiled in internal conflicts, and the military was in constant need of skilled leaders to face the mounting external threats. Napoleon's breakthrough came in 1795, when Paris was on the brink of civil unrest. The royalist forces, who supported the monarchy, had gathered in the city, seeking to restore the old order. The National Convention, under threat from these royalists, called upon Napoleon to defend the revolution. Napoleon's response was swift and decisive. Using his artillery expertise, he organized a devastating bombardment of the royalist forces, forcing them to retreat in what became known as the 13 Vendémiaire. His ability to swiftly suppress the threat with minimal casualties showcased not only his military acumen, but also his growing political influence. His success in this battle earned him the trust of the revolutionary leaders and secured his place in the heart of the French political and military establishment. Following his success in Paris, Napoleon's career took another crucial turn. The Directory, now aware of his talent, sent him to Italy in 1796 to command the French forces there. Italy was a key battlefield in the ongoing wars of the First Coalition, where France faced off against several European monarchies. The French army in Italy was demoralized, poorly supplied, and outnumbered by the Austrian forces stationed in the region. Yet Napoleon saw this as an opportunity to prove himself once again. In Italy, Napoleon displayed extraordinary strategic brilliance. Over the next 2 years, he led a series of decisive victories against the Austrian forces, including the Battle of Lodi and the Siege of Mantua. His military genius, his ability to inspire his troops, and his boldness on the battlefield were all displayed in full force. By 1797, Napoleon had forced the Austrians to the negotiating table, resulting in the Treaty of Campo Formio, which effectively ended the war in Italy in France's favor. Napoleon's Italian campaign not only expanded French territory, but also solidified his reputation as one of the greatest military commanders in history. His success in Italy brought him fame across Europe, and his influence back in France grew exponentially. The Directory, now relying on Napoleon for further military success, began to view him as both a powerful ally and a potential rival. After his stunning victories in Italy, Napoleon returned to France as a national hero. His reputation had spread far beyond the borders of his homeland, and he was now one of the most famous men in Europe. Yet, despite his military success, Napoleon found himself facing a French government that was unstable and increasingly unpopular. The Directory, the governing body that had replaced the monarchy after the Revolution, was corrupt and ineffective, unable to address France's deepening crises of war, debt, and civil unrest. By 1799, the First Coalition Wars had taken their toll on France, and Napoleon, despite his successes, had been largely sidelined by the revolutionary leadership. However, his time in Italy had given him a deep understanding of not only military strategy, but also the political landscape. As he spent more time in Paris, Napoleon became increasingly aware of the disillusionment with the current government. The people of France were tired of the endless wars, economic instability, and political corruption. It was clear to him that a change was needed, and he saw an opportunity to seize control. The political situation in Paris was volatile. The Directory had lost its grip on power, and the country was facing internal divisions, with royalist factions and radical revolutionaries vying for influence. Napoleon saw the disarray as his chance to take control, but he needed to move swiftly and decisively. In November 1799, Napoleon, with the backing of key political figures including Paul Barras, orchestrated a coup d'état that would change the course of French history. On November 9, 1799, 18 Brumaire in the revolutionary calendar, Napoleon and his allies seized control of the National Convention, the legislative body of France. With the country on the brink of collapse, he proposed a new form of government known as the consulate, which would centralize power and provide strong leadership. Napoleon positioned himself as the first consul, effectively making him the most powerful figure in France. The coup was remarkably swift, and despite some initial resistance, Napoleon's forces quickly neutralized any opposition. The success of the coup marked the beginning of Napoleon's dominance in French politics. Within just a few months, Napoleon had transformed himself from a celebrated military general into the leader of France. Though his rise to power was initially based on the premise of preserving the ideals of the Revolution, liberty, equality, and fraternity, it quickly became clear that Napoleon's ambitions went beyond these principles. His vision for France was not one of democracy, but of strong, centralized authority, with him at the helm. Napoleon's new government, the consulate, promised stability and reform. Yet, beneath the veneer of republican ideals, the first consul was moving ever closer to becoming a ruler with near-absolute power. His rise to power marked the end of the French Revolution in its original form, and the beginning of a new era, one in which Napoleon would cement his place as one of the most influential figures in world history. With the coup of 18 Brumaire in 1799, Napoleon Bonaparte had effectively brought an end to the chaotic years of the Directory and taken control of France. However, his initial rise to power as first consul was strategic and pragmatic. Napoleon knew that to maintain his dominance, he would have to consolidate not just military control, but also political power, transforming the government and society to reflect his authority. As first consul, Napoleon held executive power over France, a position that he used to centralize control and reshape the French state. Despite the new government being called the consulate, which presented itself as a republican form of government, it was clear that Napoleon was the ultimate authority. The system allowed for the appearance of checks and balances, with two other consuls serving with Napoleon, but in reality, he was the one calling the shots. This was a system designed to secure his power while still maintaining a semblance of revolutionary ideals. One of Napoleon's first moves was to restore order and stabilize France, which had been mired in chaos since the revolution began a decade earlier. He understood that to keep the people and the military on his side, he had to address France's dire financial situation, the instability of the revolution, and the ongoing wars that France was involved in. The French economy was in ruins, inflation was rampant, and much of the population was still deeply scarred by the violence of the Reign of Terror. Napoleon knew that, for the revolution to continue, it needed a strong, capable leader. To secure his position, Napoleon implemented a series of reforms aimed at stabilizing the economy and consolidating his power. One of the most important of these reforms was the establishment of the Bank of France in 1800. The bank helped to stabilize the French currency and created a more orderly financial system, which was essential for rebuilding the country after years of economic turmoil. Napoleon also introduced a new tax system, which centralized revenue collection and helped to fund his military campaigns. Beyond economics, Napoleon understood that he needed to win the support of the French people and ensure that his government was seen as legitimate. One of his most important actions was to negotiate a concordat with the Catholic Church in 1801, which effectively ended the conflict between the revolutionary government and the Church. By recognizing Catholicism as the religion of the majority of French citizens, Napoleon was able to heal a rift that had existed since the Revolution's radical phase, in which the Church had been a target of revolutionary violence. Napoleon's reforms were designed to strengthen his hold on France and to present himself as both a product of the Revolution and the savior of France. He didn't just maintain the ideals of the Revolution, equality before the law and liberty of religion, but he also knew that his leadership would need to go beyond them. His reforms brought stability, but they also brought centralized power, with Napoleon at the center. His vision of a unified, powerful state was coming to fruition, and France, once again, was being remade under the influence of one man's will. But Napoleon's ambition didn't stop at France's borders. As first consul, Napoleon was already planning how to expand French influence beyond the revolutionary ideals. His vision for France was not just about maintaining power domestically. It was about building an empire that could dominate Europe and ensure France's position as the preeminent power of the continent. By 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte had effectively transformed from a military general into the most powerful man in France, and his ambitions were becoming clearer. After securing his position as first consul and stabilizing the French state, he turned his attention to consolidating his power on a much grander scale. While many hailed Napoleon as the savior of France, bringing peace after the revolution's chaos, his vision of France and his place in the world reached far beyond the Republic. Napoleon, aware of his immense popularity and the loyalty of both the military and the French people, began to move towards the idea of establishing a dynasty. His reign, he believed, should not only be marked by the stability of France, but by a sense of lasting legacy. And so, He began toying with the idea of transforming the republic into a monarchy, but one that would be different from the old absolute monarchy that the Revolution had destroyed. His monarchy would be rooted in revolutionary ideals, where the people's rights, the law, and merit would determine a ruler's legitimacy, not divine right or aristocratic birth. In 1804, after years of reforms and military successes, Napoleon took the monumental step of declaring himself Emperor of the French. His ambition to establish himself as an emperor was not just about political control. It was about creating an empire that could rival the great monarchies of Europe. But to do so, Napoleon needed to legitimize his rule both within France and abroad. The historic coronation ceremony on December 2nd, 1804, held at the magnificent Notre Dame Cathedral in Paris, was a spectacle that symbolized Napoleon's rise from revolutionary general to emperor. The ceremony was rich in both symbolism and power. What made it particularly striking was that Napoleon crowned himself. This dramatic act, where he took the crown from the Pope, Pius VII, and placed it on his own head, sent a clear message. Napoleon did not need the approval of the church or any external power to rule. His authority came from his own ability, his merit, and the will of the people, who had long embraced him as their leader. By crowning himself, Napoleon effectively cut ties with the traditions of the old monarchy and established his authority as rooted in the revolutionary spirit of merit and ambition. He wanted to send a clear message that while he was adopting the imperial trappings of the past, he was different. His empire was based on the strength of the people and the revolution, not divine right or aristocratic privilege. Yet, despite these revolutionary overtones, his coronation marked the end of the French Republic and the beginning of a new imperial era, one where the ideals of the revolution were reshaped under his vision. Following his coronation, Napoleon wasted no time in consolidating his control over both France and the wider European continent. He would expand his empire aggressively through military conquests, which would ultimately shape the future of Europe. However, despite the grandeur of his new title and position, his path to power was not without obstacles. Opposition from other European powers remained strong, and internal dissent, though temporarily suppressed, lingered. Napoleon's decision to crown himself, while signaling a break from the old France, also signified a new era of personal rule. The emperor was not just a monarch in the traditional sense, but a military leader, reformer, and visionary. With his coronation as emperor in 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte was not only the ruler of France, but he began to envision a much broader European empire, one that would extend French influence across the continent. His imperial ambitions were driven by a belief that France needed to dominate Europe, both for its security and for its rightful place as a global power. This vision would lead to a series of military campaigns that became known as the Napoleonic Wars, which spanned over a decade and reshaped the map of Europe. Napoleon's military genius, his ability to inspire his troops, and his boldness on the battlefield allowed him to achieve stunning victories against a series of powerful coalitions that ranged from Britain and Russia to Austria and Prussia. The first major success came in 1805, when Napoleon decisively defeated the combined forces of Austria and Russia at the Battle of Austerlitz, often regarded as one of his greatest triumphs. Known as the Battle of the Three Emperors, it cemented Napoleon's dominance over Central Europe and crushed any hopes of a coalition victory. Napoleon's strategy was built on speed, deception, and maneuver. He would move his armies rapidly, often striking before the enemy could react or regroup. At Austerlitz, Napoleon used his knowledge of terrain and his understanding of his enemy's psychology to create a victory from what appeared to be a vulnerable position. His forces outflanked the larger enemy forces, decimating them and forcing Austria and Russia to seek peace, solidifying Napoleon's control over much of Europe. After Austerlitz, Napoleon's empire began to grow rapidly. He established satellite states across Europe, including the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states that was placed under French protection. Napoleon also installed his family members as rulers in various territories, further securing his grip on the continent. His brother Joseph became King of Spain, his brother Louis became King of Holland, and his stepson Eugene de Beauharnais was made Viceroy of Italy. Napoleon was building an empire of client states, where his influence was paramount, but local rulers were beholden to him. However, while his expansion seemed unstoppable, the foundations of his empire were far from secure. Napoleon's success on the battlefield was undeniable, but the wars and the demands of maintaining control over an ever-expanding empire began to take their toll. France was constantly at war, with enemies surrounding it on all sides. Napoleon's continental system, which aimed to cripple Britain economically by blocking trade with European nations, placed additional strain on the economy, leading to tensions with his allies. Napoleon's aggressive expansion also stirred resentment. Many of the nations he conquered, including Spain and parts of Italy, began to push back against French control. The Peninsular War, which began in 1808, saw Spain and Portugal rise in rebellion, with British forces supporting the insurgents. The conflict would become one of Napoleon's most difficult and costly wars, draining resources and manpower. Despite these challenges, Napoleon's military prowess remained formidable, and his empire continued to expand, reaching its zenith by 1812. At the height of his power, Napoleon controlled much of Europe, from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the borders of Russia in the east. Yet, this moment of triumph would prove to be Napoleon's greatest weakness. His empire, vast and powerful, was also overextended. The forces required to maintain control were immense, and Napoleon's military campaigns were stretching his resources thin. The seeds of his eventual downfall were already sown, not by external threats, but by the strain of maintaining an empire built on constant war. By the time Napoleon had reached the height of his power, his empire stretched from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the borders of Russia in the east. However, his ambition didn't stop at military conquest. He sought to reshape Europe economically as well. His attempt to weaken Britain and secure French dominance across the continent led to the implementation of the Continental System, a sweeping trade embargo designed to isolate Britain economically and prevent its goods from entering Europe. The Continental System was Napoleon's answer to Britain's naval superiority. Britain, with its powerful navy, had successfully blockaded French ports and prevented French goods from reaching global markets. To retaliate, Napoleon aimed to force all of Europe to stop trading with Britain. His idea was simple. By cutting off Britain from the European market, he could cripple its economy and force it to submit to French control. However, implementing this system proved to be more difficult than Napoleon anticipated. While France and its allies complied, many of Napoleon's client states were not eager to cut ties with Britain, particularly because of Britain's dominance in global trade. Spain, in particular, was reluctant to participate fully in the blockade, and Napoleon faced increasing resistance from within his own empire. The Peninsular War, 1808 to 1814, was a direct result of this pressure, as Spain and Portugal resisted French control and continued trading with Britain. The war dragged on, draining French resources and contributing to Napoleon's growing difficulties. As the Continental System became more entrenched, it began to have unintended consequences. Rather than breaking Britain economically, it led to widespread smuggling, as merchants found ways to bypass Napoleon's blockade. The economic hardship caused by the embargo, particularly in countries like Russia and Germany, also fueled resentment against French rule. Napoleon's idea of a united, cooperative Europe began to fracture under the strain of economic hardship and nationalist sentiment. Nationalism, which had been a driving force behind Napoleon's own rise to power, now turned against him. In countries under French occupation, the spirit of nationalism began to rise as people resisted foreign domination. The more Napoleon tried to impose his rule, the more these national identities solidified, particularly in Spain, where the Spanish Inquisition and Catholic Church became symbols of resistance. Guerrilla warfare, or partisan warfare, became a powerful force against the French army, with Spanish civilians taking up arms against the invaders. Napoleon's other major challenge came from Russia, which had initially supported the Continental System. However, in 1812, Tsar Alexander I grew frustrated with the economic strain caused by the embargo and began to make overtures to Britain, violating the terms of the Continental System. This breach of Napoleon's embargo led to the famous French invasion of Russia, a decision that would prove disastrous and ultimately lead to the unraveling of Napoleon's empire. The Russian campaign of 1812 became one of the greatest blunders in military history. Napoleon, commanding one of the largest armies ever assembled, invaded Russia in the summer of 1812, hoping to force Tsar Alexander I to comply with the continental system. But the Russians, following their scorched earth tactics, retreated deeper into their vast territory, destroying their own land and resources as they went. By the time Napoleon reached Moscow, the city was largely abandoned and set on fire, leaving the French forces without food, shelter, or supplies. The retreat from Russia was catastrophic. Napoleon's Grand Army, once numbering over 600,000 men, was decimated by starvation, disease, and attacks from Russian forces. Only a fraction of his troops made it back to France, and the loss marked the beginning of the end of Napoleon's dominance in Europe. The continental system, which had been intended to break Britain's power, ultimately had the opposite effect, weakening Napoleon's empire and leading to rising discontent among the nations he had conquered. The year 1812 marked a dramatic turning point in Napoleon's reign, and the unfolding events of that year would set the stage for the eventual downfall of his empire. After years of expansion and conquest, Napoleon's overreaching ambition finally began to catch up with him. The Russian campaign of 1812, which he had launched with the aim of forcing Tsar Alexander I to comply with the continental system, ended in catastrophic failure and revealed the inherent weaknesses of his empire. Napoleon's invasion of Russia was one of the most ambitious military campaigns ever undertaken, with the Grand Army numbering over 600,000 men. The plan was to march into Russian territory, defeat the Russian army, and force Alexander to honor the embargo. However, the Russians employed their famous strategy of scorched earth, retreating deeper into their vast country and destroying anything of value along the way: food, shelter, and supplies. Napoleon, unfamiliar with the Russian terrain and unable to sustain such a massive army, pressed forward, eventually reaching Moscow. But instead of offering peace, the Russians burned the city to the ground. With no resources and winter fast approaching, Napoleon was forced to retreat. The retreat from Russia was a disaster for Napoleon. His army, weakened by hunger, disease, and constant Russian attacks, was decimated. Fewer than 100,000 men made it back to France, and the rest either perished or were captured. This devastating loss shattered Napoleon's image as an invincible leader and severely weakened his military power. The Russian campaign had been a pivotal moment, and it marked the beginning of the end for Napoleon's empire. Following his disastrous retreat from Russia, Napoleon faced growing opposition. The Sixth Coalition, consisting of Britain, Russia, Prussia, Spain, and other European powers, saw Napoleon's weakness as an opportunity to strike. In 1814, after a series of defeats, Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne and was exiled to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean. The fall of Napoleon was as swift as his rise, and France, once the most powerful empire in Europe, was left to rebuild in the wake of his absence. However, Napoleon was not done yet. In 1815, just under a year after his exile, he escaped from Elba and returned to France. The 100 Days, as this period is called, marked his brief resurgence as emperor. The powers of Europe, however, were not willing to allow Napoleon to return to power without a fight. The most decisive moment of his brief second reign came on June 18, 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo, where his army faced a combined force of British, Dutch, Belgian, and Prussian troops under the command of the Duke of Wellington. At Waterloo, Napoleon's military genius faltered. Despite initial successes, he made strategic mistakes that allowed the coalition forces to regroup and decisively defeat his army. Napoleon was forced to surrender once again, and this time, there would be no return. He was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena in the South Atlantic, where he spent the final years of his life. The defeat at Waterloo and his second abdication marked the end of the Napoleonic era. Napoleon Bonaparte, once the ruler of much of Europe, was now a prisoner of his own ambition. He died on May 5, 1821, after spending 6 years in exile, far from the empire he had created. His legacy, however, would live on, not in the form of an empire, but in the legal, political, and military reforms he had introduced, including the Napoleonic Code, which would influence legal systems around the world. Napoleon's rise and fall remains one of history's most remarkable stories, a tale of a man who rose from obscurity to rule much of Europe, only to fall victim to his own unrelenting pursuit of power. His empire might have crumbled, but his impact on Europe and the world would endure for centuries to come. By 1804, Napoleon Bonaparte had transformed from a revolutionary general into the Emperor of the French, securing his grip on the country through a combination of military brilliance, political savvy, and public support. His rise was not just about personal ambition. It was about creating a unified France, one that had emerged from the turmoil of the French Revolution and would now become the dominant power in Europe. At the height of his rule, Napoleon's empire was not only a reflection of his personal power, but also a testament to the strength and organization of the French state he had built. The Napoleonic Empire at its height was a product of both military conquest and political reform. Napoleon's early years as first consul had been marked by stabilizing France after the chaos of the Revolution, but it was his crowning as emperor that allowed him to solidify his authority and reshape the French political landscape. Napoleon was a master of combining the revolutionary ideals of the French Revolution, such as equality before the law and religious tolerance, with the centralized, monarchical structures that he believed were necessary to ensure order and stability. One of Napoleon's earliest and most significant reforms was the creation of the Napoleonic Code. This legal system was one of his greatest achievements, codifying laws that had been inconsistent across France into a uniform set of rules that applied to everyone equally. It abolished feudal privileges, guaranteed property rights, and placed the state as the ultimate authority. The Napoleonic Code not only brought legal stability to France, but also laid the groundwork for legal systems across Europe, and even influenced countries as far away as Latin America. Along with legal reforms, Napoleon restructured the French government into a centralized, efficient bureaucracy. He created a system where positions of power were awarded based on merit rather than birthright, an extension of the revolutionary ideals he had championed. Under Napoleon, the bureaucracy was streamlined, and local officials were appointed based on their loyalty and administrative skills. This system helped to maintain control over the vast French Empire and ensured that Napoleon's influence reached every corner of his domain. By 1810, Napoleon's empire stretched from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to Russia in the east, encompassing much of Central Europe. His conquests included not just military victories, but also the formation of client states, such as the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states under his influence, and the Kingdom of Italy, which was partially controlled by Napoleon's relatives. His brother Joseph became King of Spain, his brother Louis became King of Holland, and his stepson Eugene de Beauharnais was made Viceroy of Italy. Napoleon was not only a conqueror, but a master at political maneuvering, using his family and loyal allies to solidify his control across the continent. At the height of the Napoleonic Empire, Napoleon was at the pinnacle of his power. He was the unchallenged ruler of much of Europe, with a network of alliances, client states, and conquests that extended France's influence from the Atlantic to the Russian frontier. However, beneath this vast empire lay the seeds of its eventual downfall, as Napoleon's overextension and his continual war efforts would stretch both his resources and the patience of the countries he had conquered. At the height of his empire, Napoleon Bonaparte was not only the ruler of much of Europe, but also one of the greatest military commanders the world had ever seen. His skill on the battlefield was unmatched, and his ability to execute swift, decisive campaigns left his enemies scrambling to counter his moves. Napoleon's military genius was a crucial factor in the rapid expansion of the Napoleonic Empire, and his victories, both tactical and strategic, cemented his reputation as a military innovator and leader. Napoleon's approach to warfare was revolutionary. He broke from traditional battle tactics by employing a strategy based on speed, surprise, and maneuvering. He believed in striking swiftly and decisively before the enemy had time to regroup or form a cohesive defense. This style was in stark contrast to the traditional, static battles that had dominated European warfare for centuries. His ability to move large armies quickly across Europe and engage enemies on multiple fronts allowed him to surprise his opponents and maintain the initiative. One of his most famous victories came at the Battle of Austerlitz in 1805, often referred to as the Battle of the Three Emperors. Faced with a coalition army of Russia and Austria, Napoleon managed to defeat an enemy that outnumbered his own forces by nearly 2-1. His victory at Austerlitz solidified his reputation as a military genius. By feigning weakness and drawing the enemy into a vulnerable position, he was able to smash the Allied forces and secure control over much of Central Europe. This victory also marked the collapse of the Third Coalition, one of the many alliances formed against him by Britain, Austria, and Russia. Napoleon's tactics were not just about brute force. He was a master of psychological warfare, often using the fear of his growing empire and reputation to destabilize his enemies before the battle even began. He understood the importance of morale and often made personal efforts to inspire his troops, ensuring they were motivated and committed to the cause. His soldiers, known as the Imperial Guard, were some of the most elite and loyal troops in Europe, willing to fight and die for their emperor. Another remarkable aspect of Napoleon's military campaigns was his innovative use of artillery. He was one of the first leaders to fully integrate artillery into the center of the battlefield, using it to break enemy lines and create openings for infantry and cavalry to exploit. His use of the column formation in battle allowed him to concentrate his forces at decisive points, while his ability to move artillery rapidly gave him an edge that many of his enemies lacked. Despite the vastness of his empire, Napoleon was able to manage multiple campaigns simultaneously. The War of the Third Coalition, 1805, the War of the Fourth Coalition, 1806 to 1807, and the Peninsular War, 1808 to 1814, all demonstrated his ability to outthink and outmaneuver his enemies. His triumphs on the battlefield made him a legend, and his victories were not just about securing land. They were about instilling fear in his opponents, forcing them to reckon with the reality of French dominance. However, Napoleon's military success came at a cost. His constant campaigns and military mobilization put immense strain on both his troops and the resources of France. But for a time, Napoleon's battlefield victories overshadowed these problems, and his empire continued to grow from Spain and Italy to the Russian frontier. His armies marched across Europe, and his name became synonymous with power, strategy, and unrivaled success. In addition to his military triumphs, Napoleon Bonaparte was equally ambitious when it came to reshaping Europe's economic landscape. After consolidating his power in France and extending his empire across much of Europe, Napoleon understood that the future of his empire relied not just on military conquests, but also on controlling Europe's economic structure. To achieve this, he sought to break Britain's economic dominance, and thus he introduced the continental system. The continental system, implemented in 1806, was essentially a large-scale trade blockade aimed at crippling Britain's economy by preventing European nations under Napoleon's control from trading with the British. Napoleon's goal was simple. If Britain could be isolated from the European markets, it would be forced to surrender or face economic collapse. Napoleon believed that by depriving Britain of its main sources of income from trade and colonial exploitation, he could force the nation into submission. The system was ambitious and far-reaching. All the countries within Napoleon's empire, including Spain, Italy, and much of Central Europe, were expected to adhere to the blockade. This would mean that Britain would have no access to the vast markets of Europe, which were vital for its economy. Napoleon believed that with his military dominance over the continent, he could enforce the blockade and effectively cut Britain off from the rest of Europe. However, the continental system proved far more complicated than Napoleon had anticipated. While the French Empire and its allies were officially bound to enforce the embargo, the system was riddled with loopholes. Many European countries, especially in Spain and Portugal, had deep economic ties with Britain and were reluctant to sever them. Smuggling became widespread as merchants found ways to bypass the blockade, and Britain, with its naval power, was able to continue trade with other parts of the world, including the Americas. The Peninsular War, 1808 to 1814, was one of the most direct consequences of the continental system. When Napoleon attempted to force Spain and Portugal to comply with the blockade, he faced a fierce resistance that ultimately led to a full-scale guerrilla war. The Portuguese and Spanish, with the support of Britain, fought back fiercely, and Napoleon's attempt to maintain control over the Iberian Peninsula became a costly, drawn-out conflict that drained French resources and manpower. Moreover, Napoleon's attempts to enforce the continental system on his allies and satellite states led to growing discontent. Russia, which had initially agreed to the embargo, grew frustrated with the economic strain it placed on its economy. Tsar Alexander I eventually withdrew from the system, which prompted Napoleon's decision to invade Russia in 1812. This disastrous campaign would prove to be one of the key turning points in Napoleon's empire, leading to his eventual downfall. The continental system, while well-intentioned, ultimately backfired. Instead of crippling Britain, it contributed to economic hardship within Napoleon's own empire, especially in countries like France, where the economy struggled to adapt to the loss of trade. Smuggling networks flourished, and resentment against Napoleon's attempts to control Europe's economy grew. The embargo also failed to weaken Britain's naval power, and Britain was able to establish new trade routes and maintain its position as the world's dominant economic and colonial power. Despite these challenges, the continental system had lasting effects on the French economy and the European balance of power. It created tensions within Napoleon's empire, alienated his allies, and contributed to the fractures in the system he had worked so hard to build. Ultimately, while Napoleon's ambition to dominate both the military and economic spheres of Europe was remarkable, the continental system proved to be one of his most ambitious, yet flawed, policies. One of Napoleon Bonaparte's most significant strategies for securing his empire was his vision of a family dynasty. Unlike traditional monarchies, where power was often passed down through centuries of bloodlines, Napoleon sought to establish a new kind of dynasty, one rooted in merit and loyalty. As Emperor of the French, he began to place his relatives and trusted allies in positions of power across Europe, ensuring that his family and loyal supporters were deeply woven into the fabric of his empire. Napoleon's first move to establish his family dynasty was his own coronation as emperor in 1804. This act was not just about claiming power for himself, but also about establishing the Bonaparte name as a symbol of authority. The idea was to create a new imperial family that would rule not only France, but much of Europe, with his relatives playing pivotal roles across his vast empire. Joseph Bonaparte, Napoleon's elder brother, was the first to receive a royal title. Napoleon appointed him as the King of Naples in 1806, and later King of Spain in 1808. Joseph's rule, however, was not without challenges, as he faced constant resistance from both the Spanish people and foreign powers. His reign in Spain would eventually lead to the Peninsular War, where Napoleon's family was deeply embroiled in the conflict. Napoleon's younger brother Louis Bonaparte was made King of Holland in 1806, but his rule there was marked by conflict with his brother. Louis, a man of principle, often resisted Napoleon's demands, particularly those that would harm Dutch interests. In 1810, after a series of disagreements, Napoleon forced Louis to abdicate in favor of more direct control over the Netherlands. In addition to his brothers, Napoleon also sought to strengthen his dynasty through marriage. In 1809, after the dissolution of his first marriage to Josephine, Napoleon married Marie-Louise, the daughter of the Austrian Emperor Francis I, in a strategic alliance aimed at cementing peace with Austria. The marriage produced a son, Napoleon II, who was given the title of King of Rome. While Napoleon's son would never rule, the birth of Napoleon II was an attempt to create a legitimate heir to the empire and continue the Bonaparte lineage. Napoleon's vision for his family extended beyond France. His nephews, Jerome Bonaparte and Charles Bonaparte, were also placed in positions of power. Jerome was made King of Westphalia, a short-lived German kingdom created by Napoleon, while his other relatives were given territories in Italy, Germany, and other parts of the empire. By placing his family members in key positions, Napoleon sought to create a network of loyalty across Europe that would ensure his dynasty's survival, even after his reign. However, despite Napoleon's efforts to secure power for his family, the idea of a Bonaparte dynasty was not universally accepted. Many of the nations Napoleon conquered, including Spain, Italy, and Germany, resented the imposition of foreign rulers, and his family's rule often sparked unrest. His brothers, despite their royal titles, struggled to maintain control in the face of popular resistance and revolutionary movements. Napoleon's nepotism, placing his family in positions of power regardless of their experience, also led to a lack of effective governance, particularly in regions where his relatives lacked the popular support to maintain authority. Despite these challenges, Napoleon's family remained central to his vision of a unified Europe. They were meant to represent the legitimacy of his reign and ensure that his empire would endure. However, as Napoleon's military and political power began to unravel, so did his family's hold on Europe. By the time Napoleon was exiled to Elba in 1814, his family had been scattered across Europe, and the Bonaparte dynasty's dreams of lasting power had begun to fade. Napoleon Bonaparte's empire was not only a political and military force, but also a cultural powerhouse that reshaped the landscape of art, architecture, and intellectual life across Europe. Though his rule was primarily defined by his military conquests and political reforms, Napoleon understood the power of culture in legitimizing and immortalizing his reign. He was a leader who was deeply aware of the significance of symbols and imagery, and he used art and architecture to project power, unite his empire, and cement his legacy. One of Napoleon's key cultural initiatives was the patronage of the arts. He understood that art could be used as both a tool for propaganda and a symbol of his empire's grandeur. Napoleon sought to align himself with the great historical figures of the past, especially those of ancient Rome, and to present himself as a ruler of equal stature. This is most evident in the works commissioned during his reign, which sought to evoke the classical ideals of Rome and Greece, while also celebrating his own military and political achievements. Perhaps the most famous example of this is the painting Napoleon Crossing the Alps, created by the artist Jacques-Louis David. This iconic image depicts Napoleon on horseback, dramatically leading his army across the Alps, a metaphorical representation of his power, courage, and determination. David's work, like many others from this period, was designed to depict Napoleon as a heroic figure, larger than life, and almost godlike in his portrayal. These images were strategically placed throughout the empire to reinforce Napoleon's image as both a military genius and a savior of France. Napoleon's impact on architecture was equally profound. One of his first major projects as emperor was to revitalize Paris, transforming the city into a grand capital befitting the ruler of a vast European empire. His vision for Paris involved wide, grand boulevards, monuments, and public buildings that would serve as lasting symbols of his reign. The Arc de Triomphe, perhaps the most famous of these monuments, was commissioned by Napoleon in 1806 to commemorate his victory at Austerlitz and honor the French army. The arch stands as a symbol of the power and military success of the Napoleonic Empire, and it remains one of the most iconic landmarks in Paris today. Napoleon also initiated the creation of the Musée Napoleon, the precursor to today's Louvre Museum. He understood that art could not only be used for propaganda, but also as a way of elevating French culture to new heights. Under his rule, the Louvre became a repository of ancient artifacts and artworks, many of which were looted from Italy and other conquered territories during his campaigns. These treasures were not only meant to showcase France's dominance, but also to assert Napoleon's role as a patron of culture and a key figure in the preservation and celebration of European heritage. Napoleon's cultural initiatives extended beyond France's borders as well. Throughout Europe, he sought to impose a new French cultural identity, blending French art, architecture, and intellectual life with the traditions of the territories he conquered. He established schools of art and science in many of his satellite states and encouraged the development of literature, music, and theater. Even though these efforts were often met with resistance from local populations, the cultural influence of Napoleon's empire spread across Europe, leaving a lasting imprint on European art and thought. However, despite these cultural achievements, Napoleon's vision for art and culture was not without controversy. His use of art and architecture as a means of political propaganda was often criticized by his opponents. The militaristic imagery in many of the artworks produced during his reign, coupled with the forced imposition of French culture on conquered peoples, generated resentment. Yet, despite these tensions, Napoleon's cultural legacy remained significant, as it helped to shape the visual and architectural identity of early 19th century Europe. As Napoleon's empire expanded, it began to face a rising tide of resistance, an undercurrent of nationalism that would ultimately play a crucial role in the undoing of his vast empire. While Napoleon's military genius and political reforms had allowed him to conquer much of Europe, his centralized rule and efforts to impose French dominance across the continent were met with growing hostility, particularly from the people of the territories he had conquered. Napoleon's expansionist policies brought short-term prosperity and stability to many regions of Europe. However, over time, the imposition of French culture, laws, and economic practices began to spark resentment. His conquests not only displaced local rulers, but also disrupted centuries-old traditions and social structures. National pride became an increasingly potent force, and many saw Napoleon's rule as a form of foreign domination, no matter how benevolent or well-meaning his reforms might appear. The first significant signs of nationalist resistance began in Spain, where Napoleon's decision to place his brother, Joseph Bonaparte, on the throne of Spain in 1808 sparked an open rebellion. The Peninsular War, 1808 to 1814, was one of the most brutal and costly conflicts Napoleon would face. The Spanish people, supported by the British under Wellington, mounted a determined resistance. This conflict was marked by widespread guerrilla warfare, in which Spanish civilians and soldiers used unconventional tactics to harass and sabotage French forces. The conflict proved to be a quagmire for Napoleon, as his army was stretched thin and suffered heavy casualties, both from the military and from the harsh Spanish terrain and climate. While Spain's resistance was driven by nationalism, the influence of British support and the British Navy also played a significant role. Napoleon's continental system, designed to cripple Britain's economy by cutting off trade with Europe, had led Britain to support various insurgencies throughout Napoleon's empire. The British supplied the Spanish with arms and funds, which enabled them to continue their fight. This made Spain one of Napoleon's most difficult and long-lasting military challenges, draining France's resources and manpower for years. Simultaneously, in Germany and Italy, Napoleon's imposition of French rule began to fuel nationalist movements. Many of these countries had long histories of regionalism, and Napoleon's centralization of power into a French-controlled system caused widespread discontent. For example, in the German states, the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine, a collection of German states under Napoleon's influence, was initially seen as a way of securing peace. But over time, it became a symbol of foreign oppression, with the local populations growing increasingly resentful of French control. Napoleon's expansion of the French Empire led to the spread of revolutionary ideals, but also prompted the rise of a new kind of European nationalism, one that was motivated by the desire for self-determination and independence. In countries like Germany, Italy, and Poland, Napoleon's victories had initially been welcomed as a defeat of the old monarchies and as a promise of liberty. But as Napoleon's empire became more authoritarian and militaristic, these populations began to see him as just another foreign occupier, no different from the monarchs he had overthrown. The idea of nationhood began to take shape during this period. People in occupied territories began to see themselves not as subjects of Napoleon, but as members of their own distinct nations, with their own cultures, languages, and histories. This shift would fuel the nationalist movements that would emerge in the decades to come, eventually leading to the formation of unified nations like Germany and Italy in the 19th century. The rise of nationalism was not solely a response to French rule. It was also shaped by the romantic ideals of the time, ideas about national pride, identity, and cultural heritage. These sentiments were powerfully embodied by figures like Johann Wolfgang von Goethe and Friedrich Schiller in Germany, whose works promoted a sense of national unity and pride. Napoleon, despite his efforts to consolidate power and impose a unified European order, could not ignore the deep well of nationalist sentiment growing in the lands he had conquered. By the time of his Russian campaign in 1812, Napoleon had become increasingly isolated, with much of Europe either actively resisting or seeking to challenge his rule. As the Napoleonic Empire reached its zenith, Napoleon's ambition for a unified European continent under French control began to stretch the limits of what his empire could endure. The brilliance that had once allowed him to conquer much of Europe now became his greatest downfall, as his empire expanded to a size that was impossible to sustain. The most significant event that exposed the vulnerabilities of Napoleon's empire was his ill-fated Russian campaign of 1812, a catastrophic military disaster that would change the course of history. Napoleon's decision to invade Russia in 1812 was driven by his desire to enforce the continental system, which sought to weaken Britain economically by preventing other European nations from trading with it. Tsar Alexander I had begun to break from Napoleon's embargo, and Napoleon viewed this as a threat to the stability of his empire. In June of 1812, he assembled the Grand Army, a force of over 600,000 men, and marched into Russia with the intent of forcing Alexander to comply. Napoleon's invasion, however, was fraught with problems from the start. The Russian strategy was one of retreat and scorched earth, a tactic designed to deny Napoleon's army the resources needed to sustain itself. The Russian military retreated into the vastness of their territory, burning crops and villages along the way to deprive Napoleon's forces of supplies. This strategy severely hampered the French army's ability to live off the land, and by the time Napoleon reached Moscow in September, his troops were already weakened by hunger, disease, and the unforgiving Russian winter. Napoleon's victory at Moscow was hollow. The city was abandoned by the Russians and set on fire, leaving Napoleon's army with little to gain. Instead of achieving a decisive peace, the Russian campaign turned into a nightmare. With the winter approaching and supplies running low, Napoleon was forced to order a retreat. But the Russian winter, combined with Russian guerrilla tactics, made the retreat an unmitigated disaster. Napoleon's Grand Army, once a force of overwhelming strength, was decimated by starvation, disease, and constant attacks from Russian forces. Of the 600,000 soldiers that had set out, only a fraction made it back to France. The Russian disaster marked a significant turning point in Napoleon's reign. The defeat shattered his reputation as an invincible military leader and exposed the cracks in his empire. The massive loss of men and resources severely weakened France's military capacity, and Napoleon's enemies began to see an opportunity. The Sixth Coalition, consisting of Britain, Russia, Prussia, Spain, and other European powers, took advantage of Napoleon's vulnerability and launched a series of attacks against his weakened forces. In 1814, after a series of defeats, Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne and was exiled to the island of Elba. The Russian campaign, one of the most ambitious military campaigns in history, had not only destroyed Napoleon's Grand Army, but also set in motion the events that would bring down the entire Napoleonic Empire. While Napoleon's return from exile in 1815 during the 100 Days would be brief, the damage had already been done. His military power had been irreparably weakened, and the Battle of Waterloo would mark the definitive end of his reign. After the disastrous Russian campaign of 1812, Napoleon's empire began to unravel, setting the stage for his eventual fall from power. Despite his reputation for military brilliance, the loss of the Grand Army, compounded by a growing coalition of European enemies, left Napoleon vulnerable. In 1814, after a series of defeats at the hands of the Sixth Coalition, which included Russia, Prussia, Britain, and Spain, Napoleon was forced to abdicate the throne and was exiled to the island of Elba. The Napoleonic Empire, which had once spanned much of Europe, collapsed in a matter of months. However, Napoleon was not content with a life of exile. He was determined to regain his throne and restore his empire. In 1815, just under a year after his abdication, Napoleon made a daring escape from Elba, returning to France with a small army and a burning desire for power. His return marked the beginning of the 100 Days, a brief and dramatic resurgence that would culminate in his final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. Upon landing in France, Napoleon quickly gathered support from both the military and the people. His charisma, reputation, and the instability of the post-Napoleon French government contributed to his rapid return to power. The Bourbon monarchy, under King Louis XVIII, was deeply unpopular, and many French soldiers saw Napoleon as their true leader. Within weeks, Napoleon had reclaimed control of Paris and re-established himself as Emperor of the French. But Napoleon's return was short-lived. The European powers, still wary of his ambitions, quickly formed the Seventh Coalition, comprising Britain, Prussia, Russia, Austria, and others. They would not allow Napoleon to regain control of Europe. In June 1815, Napoleon faced a decisive battle in Belgium at Waterloo, where the combined forces of British and Prussian armies, led by the Duke of Wellington and Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, clashed with Napoleon's forces in what would be his final stand. The Battle of Waterloo was Napoleon's most significant and final defeat. Despite initial successes and his usual brilliance in military tactics, Napoleon faced several key disadvantages. His forces were outnumbered, and the arrival of Prussian reinforcements turned the tide against him. The French army, exhausted and demoralized after years of continuous warfare, was overwhelmed by the combined might of the Allied forces. Napoleon was decisively defeated, and his fate was sealed. After his defeat at Waterloo, Napoleon was forced to abdicate for the second time. This time, there would be no escape. He was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, located in the South Atlantic, where he would spend the remaining years of his life in confinement. The French Empire that Napoleon had worked so hard to build and expand was no more. Napoleon's death on May 5, 1821, marked the definitive end of the Napoleonic era. While his empire may have fallen, his legacy endured. The Napoleonic Code, his military strategies, and his influence on European politics left a profound mark on history. In many ways, Napoleon's empire was a reflection of both the possibilities and limits of revolutionary ambition, military genius, and a quest for power. Though Napoleon's reign lasted just over a decade, his impact on France and Europe would resonate for generations. His rise and fall remain one of the most captivating stories in history, a tale of brilliance, ambition, and ultimate tragedy. The Napoleonic Empire may have crumbled, but the world would continue to feel the reverberations of his time on the throne. By 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte was at the height of his power, having successfully expanded his empire across most of Europe. He had created a system of alliances, client states, and direct control that stretched from the Iberian Peninsula in the west to the Russian frontier in the east. Yet, despite his overwhelming control over much of the continent, Napoleon's empire faced a critical challenge in the form of Russia. Tsar Alexander I had become increasingly reluctant to comply with Napoleon's continental system, a trade embargo designed to isolate Britain and cripple its economy. Russia, despite being a part of Napoleon's alliance system, had begun to trade with Britain, causing a rupture in the diplomatic relationship between the two powers. Napoleon, ever the strategist, could not tolerate this breach of the embargo. The continental system was at the core of his vision for a united Europe, and the defiance of Russia threatened the very foundation of his empire. Tsar Alexander I, too, was seeking more autonomy in his foreign policy and wanted to assert Russia's independence from Napoleon's dominance. In June 1812, Napoleon made the fateful decision to invade Russia, thinking that he could quickly bring Tsar Alexander to heel and restore order to his imperial system. Napoleon's decision to march into Russia was grounded in his belief that his grand army, an overwhelming force of over 600,000 men, including soldiers from across his empire, could crush any Russian resistance. The invasion would become one of the most ambitious military campaigns in history, though it would ultimately prove to be one of Napoleon's greatest blunders. Napoleon envisioned a quick and decisive campaign. He believed that once he reached Moscow, the Russian capital, Tsar Alexander would be forced to capitulate, much like his other enemies had. Napoleon underestimated the scale of the challenge he was about to face. One of the key reasons Napoleon chose to invade Russia was to assert his dominance over Europe and to force the Tsar to comply with the continental system. Russia's vast landmass and the harsh climate were known obstacles, but Napoleon believed his military prowess would be sufficient to overcome them. He also expected that the sheer size of his army and his superior tactics would overwhelm the Russian forces. Napoleon's earlier campaigns had been marked by stunning victories, and he believed that this would be no different. However, from the outset, the campaign encountered significant logistical and strategic challenges. Russia's vast terrain posed a major problem for Napoleon's forces. The Russians, under Tsar Alexander I, employed a strategy of scorched earth, retreating deep into their territory while burning villages, crops, and supplies along the way. This tactic was designed to deprive Napoleon's army of the resources it needed to survive the grueling march into Russia. Despite the early optimism, Napoleon was about to face a series of setbacks that would turn his invasion into a disaster. Napoleon's invasion of Russia in June 1812 began with the confidence and military precision that had characterized many of his previous campaigns. His Grand Army, consisting of soldiers from across his empire, including French, Italians, Germans, and Poles, was one of the largest military forces ever assembled. With such a formidable army, Napoleon expected to quickly overwhelm the Russian forces, forcing Tsar Alexander I to negotiate and rejoin the continental system. At the start of the campaign, Napoleon's forces advanced rapidly, pushing through Russian territory with little immediate resistance. The Russian army, under Tsar Alexander, adopted a strategy of retreating deeper into their homeland, avoiding direct confrontation and drawing the French deeper into the vast expanse of Russia. This tactic was designed to weaken Napoleon's forces through attrition, depriving them of supplies and forcing them to stretch their supply lines across the treacherous terrain. As Napoleon's army advanced, the sheer size of Russia and the harsh climate began to take their toll. The further Napoleon pushed, the harder it became to maintain supply lines. The Russian strategy of scorched earth, burning crops, villages, and towns to deny Napoleon's army the resources it needed, began to take a devastating toll on his forces. Despite initial successes, Napoleon's Grand Army was soon finding itself in a logistical nightmare. As they marched deeper into Russia, Napoleon's troops were faced with a lack of provisions and an increasingly hostile environment. The Russian army, meanwhile, was not engaging Napoleon directly in large-scale battles. Instead, they employed a strategy of hit-and-run tactics, harassing the advancing French forces while avoiding pitched battles. The Russians also used their knowledge of the terrain to great advantage, retreating into the vast wilderness, leaving Napoleon's forces to struggle with the relentless heat, scarcity of supplies, and the mounting psychological strain of an extended campaign. Napoleon's troops began to suffer from disease, starvation, and the exhausting marches. The lack of adequate provisions, combined with the harsh weather and long distances, severely weakened the Grand Army. Yet, despite these growing difficulties, Napoleon pressed forward, believing that the capture of Moscow would force the Tsar to surrender. He continued to push deeper into Russian territory, undeterred by the mounting challenges, until he finally reached Moscow in September 1812. However, when Napoleon and his forces arrived at Moscow, they found the city largely abandoned. In an effort to deny Napoleon the symbolic victory of occupying the Russian capital, Tsar Alexander had ordered the city to be set on fire. The flames that consumed Moscow not only deprived Napoleon's forces of crucial shelter and supplies, but also symbolized the futility of his conquest. Instead of receiving the surrender he anticipated, Napoleon was faced with a desolate city and an army that was growing weaker by the day. Despite the seeming victory of entering Moscow, the Russian disaster was beginning to unfold. With no peace agreement in sight, Napoleon's army was left without the resources it so desperately needed, and winter was fast approaching. The plan to force Alexander to negotiate had failed. Instead, Napoleon was faced with the grim reality that he had overextended his forces and miscalculated the strength of Russian resolve. After Napoleon's triumphant entry into Moscow in September 1812, the French emperor was confronted with the harsh realities of his overambitious campaign. His expectations had been high. He believed that the capture of Russia's capital would force Tsar Alexander I to negotiate a peace agreement and end the costly conflict. Instead, he was met with an empty, burned city, leaving Napoleon in a state of confusion and desperation. Moscow, the cultural and spiritual heart of Russia, was now little more than smoldering ruins, with only the French army and a few civilians left in the aftermath. Napoleon's situation was dire. His army, stretched thin by the long campaign, was facing growing supply shortages, the onset of winter, and an enemy who refused to engage in a decisive battle. The Russians, under Tsar Alexander, had adopted a policy of retreating deeper into the interior, refusing to be drawn into a single, large confrontation. Instead of surrendering, the Russians relied on scorched earth tactics and weathered the storm by dispersing into the vastness of their homeland. The result was that Napoleon's forces, despite occupying Moscow, found themselves trapped without the resources to continue. For weeks, Napoleon remained in Moscow, waiting for a response from the Russian Tsar. The French emperor hoped that Alexander would relent, but instead, the Tsar showed no interest in negotiating. The Russians were resolute in their desire to maintain their independence, and French forces were left to suffer in the ruins of the city. Napoleon's hopes of a quick victory began to fade, and he became increasingly desperate. His army, facing harsh conditions and without a clear supply line, was falling apart. Starvation, disease, and the effects of cold weather began to take a heavy toll on his men. To make matters worse, Moscow itself was not the refuge Napoleon had hoped for. The city's strategic importance had been rendered moot by the fact that it had been burned by its own people, and the Russian forces were not going to relent. Napoleon had hoped for a peace settlement that would allow him to return to Europe, but the Russian resistance was stronger than he had anticipated. The Russian guerrilla tactics, small skirmishes, and the psychological strain on his soldiers were draining Napoleon's once invincible Grand Army. The invasion of Moscow had backfired. Napoleon, unable to secure peace, was now facing the brutal reality of a failed campaign. He had advanced too far into Russian territory without considering the long-term consequences of a winter march. Moscow had not been a victory, it had been a trap. With his forces weakened by disease and exhaustion, Napoleon was confronted by the impossibility of a decisive victory in Russia. As weeks passed, the Russian forces had not only forced Napoleon to fight for his survival, but had begun to undermine his position completely. By the time Napoleon finally gave the order to retreat in October 1812, the reality of the situation had become inescapable. His Grand Army was now in full retreat, vulnerable to attack from both Russian forces and the elements. Napoleon's decision to retreat from Moscow in October 1812 marked the beginning of what would become one of the most disastrous military withdrawals in history. What had started as a confident and ambitious invasion had now spiraled into a desperate flight for survival. With the onset of winter and no victory to show for his efforts, Napoleon had no choice but to retreat from Moscow, but the dire circumstances would prove far more perilous than he had anticipated. The French Grand Army, which had once numbered over 600,000 men, was now severely weakened by disease, hunger, and the harsh conditions of the Russian countryside. Despite Napoleon's military genius, the retreat was a logistical nightmare. The vast Russian terrain, which had once offered Napoleon the advantage of maneuverability, now worked against him. The lack of supplies, combined with the brutal Russian winter, made the retreat incredibly difficult. Food supplies dwindled, and many soldiers, weakened by fatigue and cold, began to collapse. Napoleon's troops were subjected to extreme cold, with temperatures plunging as low as -30 degrees Celsius. The soldiers, many of them without proper winter clothing, were forced to march across the frozen landscape, often with little more than crumbs of bread to sustain them. As the retreat continued, starvation and frostbite became widespread, and large numbers of soldiers perished as they tried to make their way out of Russia. The Russian army, though exhausted from the earlier battles, took advantage of Napoleon's vulnerable position. Tsar Alexander I's forces pursued the French army relentlessly, using small, mobile units to harass the retreating forces. Russian cavalry, along with local militia groups, attacked stragglers and captured any soldiers who couldn't keep up. The Grand Army, which had once seemed unstoppable, was now an exhausted, decimated force, retreating in disarray. Napoleon's command began to fracture as well. His generals, facing a collapse in morale and leadership, began to question his decisions. The French army, once a symbol of discipline and unity, was now unraveling under the pressure of a retreat that had no end in sight. Napoleon had believed that the Russian army would eventually collapse under the strain of his invasion, but it was his own forces who were now falling apart. One of the most tragic moments of the retreat occurred at the River Berezina, where Napoleon's army was forced to cross in late November. The crossing was chaotic, and as French troops struggled to escape, the Russian forces launched attacks that trapped many soldiers. Thousands drowned or were captured as they tried to flee. The French army's retreat turned into a disastrous rout, and by the time Napoleon reached the relative safety of Poland in December 1812, fewer than 100,000 men remained of the original Grand Army. Napoleon's retreat from Russia was not just a military failure. It was a catastrophic collapse that shattered the myth of his invincibility. The Grand Army, once the strongest fighting force in Europe, was left in ruins. The campaign had drained Napoleon's resources, morale, and military strength, and his reputation as a military genius was irreparably damaged. The retreat not only marked the end of Napoleon's hopes of forcing a peace settlement with Russia, but also signaled the beginning of his decline as ruler of Europe. By the end of 1812, Napoleon's once mighty Grand Army had been decimated by the brutal Russian campaign. The catastrophic retreat from Moscow left France with fewer than 100,000 soldiers, a fraction of the force Napoleon had led into Russia that summer. The loss of over 500,000 men, combined with the ravaging effects of disease, starvation, and constant Russian harassment, shattered the military strength of the Napoleonic Empire. The scale of the disaster had profound consequences, both militarily and politically, and it marked the beginning of the unraveling of Napoleon's dominance over Europe. Napoleon had always prided himself on his ability to project invincibility, his strategic brilliance, his unshakable confidence, and his ability to inspire his army. The Russian disaster exposed the fallibility of his empire and showed that even the might of France could be broken. For the first time, Europe began to see Napoleon as vulnerable, and his enemies, who had once feared his power, began to regain confidence. The consequences of the Russian campaign were not only military, but political as well. Napoleon's defeat and the catastrophic losses in Russia opened the door for the Sixth Coalition, a group of European powers that included Britain, Russia, Prussia, Sweden, Spain, and Portugal, to form an alliance against France. The coalition had long been wary of Napoleon's ambitions, but lacked the military strength to confront him directly. The Russian campaign, however, had weakened France, and the coalition was eager to take advantage of Napoleon's vulnerabilities. By 1813, the coalition had launched a full-scale invasion of France. The Battle of Leipzig, also known as the Battle of Nations, took place in October 1813 and was Napoleon's first significant defeat on French soil. The battle, which involved over 600,000 soldiers from the coalition and Napoleon's forces, was a decisive victory for the Allies. The French were decisively routed, and Napoleon was forced to retreat, eventually giving up control of much of Germany and Central Europe. The defeat at Leipzig marked the beginning of the end for the Napoleonic Empire. The coalition forces pushed towards France, and Napoleon, now facing multiple fronts, could no longer maintain the same level of military dominance. Napoleon's position was further weakened by internal dissent in France. As the war dragged on, public opinion began to turn against him. The French people, once so devoted to their emperor, were growing weary of constant warfare and the heavy toll it was taking on the country. The economic strain of the wars, along with the loss of life and the destruction caused by years of military conflict, eroded the support Napoleon had once enjoyed. In 1814, as the coalition forces marched into Paris, Napoleon was forced to abdicate for the first time. The Treaty of Fontainebleau was signed, and Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba. The once proud emperor, who had dominated Europe for over a decade, was now a prisoner of his own ambition. His empire, which had seemed unassailable just a few years earlier, had crumbled under the weight of overextension, military defeat, and internal unrest. Napoleon's exile to Elba marked the official collapse of the Napoleonic Empire, but his story was far from over. His remarkable return from exile in 1815 for the 100 Days would briefly reignite his power, but it would ultimately end in his final defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. Napoleon's Russian disaster of 1812 had far-reaching consequences not just for France, but for the entire European continent. The collapse of the Napoleonic Empire marked the end of an era of revolutionary warfare and the beginning of a new European order. For Napoleon, the loss of the Grand Army and the failure to defeat Russia was a turning point that would ultimately lead to his downfall. However, the consequences of his invasion extended beyond his personal fall from power. The aftermath of the Russian campaign reshaped the future of Europe, and it would influence the political landscape for years to come. Napoleon's defeat in Russia not only shattered his military strength, but also revealed the fragility of his empire. The vast expanse of Napoleon's empire, which had seemed invincible just a few years earlier, was now exposed to the full force of coalition resistance. The Sixth Coalition, initially cautious in their opposition, now saw an opportunity to bring down Napoleon once and for all. As Napoleon's military power waned, the coalition armies, emboldened by their success in Russia, began to march towards France. The Battle of Leipzig, 1813, was the turning point in the Napoleonic Wars, and after that, it was clear that the empire Napoleon had built was on the brink of collapse. The restoration of the Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII in 1814 was one of the first major political changes to come after Napoleon's exile to Elba. France, tired of years of war and devastation, welcomed the return of a monarch, though the Bourbon restoration was not without its challenges. The return of the old regime was a compromise, one that sought to balance the ideas of the revolution with the return to royal authority. Yet, the monarchy's legitimacy was never fully accepted by all, and many French people still clung to the memory of Napoleon's reign. In 1815, Napoleon's brief return from exile, known as the 100 Days, was an attempt to restore his empire, but it ended in defeat at the Battle of Waterloo. The battle, fought in Belgium, was Napoleon's final stand. The combined forces of the Seventh Coalition, led by Britain's Duke of Wellington and Prussia's Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, decisively defeated Napoleon. This defeat ended his rule for good, and Napoleon was exiled to the remote island of St. Helena, where he would spend the last years of his life. Napoleon's fall from power left Europe in a state of flux, but the Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, sought to restore stability by redrawing the map of Europe. The main goal of the Congress was to contain French power and prevent any one nation from dominating the continent again. The balance of power was restored, with Great Britain, Austria, Prussia, and Russia emerging as the principal powers in Europe. The Holy Alliance, a coalition of monarchies led by Russia, was formed to suppress revolutionary movements and maintain the conservative order. While Napoleon's empire was gone, his legacy endured. The Napoleonic Code, which Napoleon had established as the legal foundation of his empire, continued to influence legal systems in France and many of the countries he had conquered. His military tactics and innovations, particularly his use of artillery and fast-moving army corps, became foundational to military strategy in the 19th century. Furthermore, the spread of nationalism that had been ignited by Napoleon's conquests would continue to shape Europe's political evolution, paving the way for the unification of Germany and Italy later in the century. The Russian disaster of 1812 and the subsequent collapse of Napoleon's empire marked the end of one of the most turbulent chapters in European history. Napoleon's rise and fall were a reflection of the forces of revolution and reaction, and the impact of his reign would be felt in the shaping of modern Europe. While Napoleon's empire was short-lived, the changes he initiated in the legal, military, and political spheres would leave a profound and lasting imprint on Europe and the world. After his forced abdication in 1814, Napoleon Bonaparte was exiled to the small island of Elba, a distant Mediterranean rock where he was meant to spend the remainder of his life in isolation. Yet, Napoleon's spirit could not be confined to such a fate. His exile, far from breaking his ambition, gave him time to reflect and plan his dramatic return to power. The European powers, who had grown wary of his power, were still reeling from the tumult of the Napoleonic Wars, and the balance of power in Europe was fragile. Napoleon's return to France in March 1815 marked the beginning of the 100 Days, a brief but intense period of his reign that would see him attempt to reassert his control over France and the wider European continent. After his escape from Elba, Napoleon made his way to the French mainland with a handful of loyal followers and a single, determined mission to reclaim his throne. His journey started with a small, humble boat, but it would set the stage for a dramatic resurgence of Napoleonic power. The political situation in France was ripe for such a return. The Bourbon monarchy, under Louis XVIII, had been restored to the throne after Napoleon's first abdication, but the French people were far from unified behind the new king. Louis XVIII's reign had been marked by discontent and instability. Many French citizens, exhausted by the endless wars and the shifting political landscape, had little loyalty to the Bourbons. The king's return to power had been seen as a restoration of the old order, which many found unsatisfactory. The memories of Napoleon's reign, when France had been a dominant force in Europe, still lingered among the people, particularly the soldiers who had fought in his campaigns. Napoleon's charisma, military genius, and political acumen quickly became evident as he began his march to Paris. Upon landing in Cannes on March 1st, 1815, he was greeted by enthusiastic crowds, including many of his former soldiers. With his army growing day by day, Napoleon made his way to Paris. Along the way, the few forces loyal to Louis XVIII quickly deserted, and Napoleon's momentum gained strength. As he entered Paris on March 20th, just 10 days after landing, he had regained control of the capital without significant resistance. Napoleon's return was met with mixed reactions across Europe. His swift reclaiming of power sent shockwaves through the continent. The Sixth Coalition, which had defeated Napoleon in 1814 and forced him into exile, began to regroup, realizing that they would once again have to deal with the threat of a resurgent Napoleon. But within France, many viewed his return with hope. The period of the 100 Days was not only a political comeback for Napoleon, it was also a brief period of immense popularity among the French people. Napoleon reinstated several of the reforms from his earlier reign, such as the Napoleonic Code, and promised stability and glory for France once again. As Napoleon sought to solidify his power, the international community began to prepare for the inevitable conflict. Europe would not allow Napoleon to remain unchallenged, and soon, the battle for his future would unfold on the battlefield. But before that, Napoleon's return had re-energized his supporters and rekindled the flame of Napoleonic ambition that had once swept across Europe. Napoleon's return to France in March 1815 was met with immediate enthusiasm from his supporters, but it also set the stage for an impending war with the European powers that had spent years defeating him. His goal, at this point, was clear: reclaim his throne and reassert French dominance in Europe. But the situation was far from simple. Napoleon's rapid rise to power in the 100 Days was not just a political maneuver. It was also the precursor to a military conflict that would soon engulf all of Europe. As Napoleon entered Paris, he wasted little time in preparing for the inevitable battle. He knew that Europe would not tolerate his return, and the Bourbon monarchy had been overthrown with alarming ease. But the European powers had already begun to rally against him. The Sixth Coalition, which included Britain, Prussia, Russia, Austria, and Sweden, had defeated Napoleon in 1814, and they quickly began to mobilize their armies once more. Their goal was to crush the threat of a resurgent Napoleon before he could re-establish his former empire. Napoleon's task was daunting. He had to rebuild his army from the ground up. Many of the experienced soldiers who had served him in the previous wars were either dead or scattered across Europe. However, Napoleon was a master at inspiring his troops, and within weeks, he had assembled an army of around 200,000 men, mostly composed of veterans of his earlier campaigns. Many of these soldiers were excited to return to battle under the banner of their former emperor, eager to reclaim the glory they had once known under Napoleon's rule. Napoleon's leadership and the loyalty of his soldiers helped him quickly assemble a formidable fighting force. Napoleon also called upon his old allies and marshals to help lead his army into battle. Among those who rallied to his side were Marshal Ney, one of Napoleon's most trusted generals, and Marshal Soult, a highly skilled strategist. Despite being outnumbered by the armies of the Sixth Coalition, Napoleon's tactical genius gave him a significant edge. His army, though smaller, was highly trained, motivated, and experienced, and Napoleon's ability to move swiftly and decisively would prove critical. While preparing his forces, Napoleon also began to re-establish control over the French government. He reintroduced key reforms, such as the Napoleonic Code, and tried to consolidate his power by making alliances with various French political factions. He also knew that in order to succeed, he would need to secure the loyalty of both the French people and the military. Napoleon's return was not just a military campaign. It was also a political and ideological struggle, a battle for legitimacy. Napoleon's preparations, however, were not without challenges. The Sixth Coalition was gathering strength, and Europe was united in its resolve to defeat him. Napoleon's forces would soon face the combined armies of the coalition in what would become the defining conflict of his return, the Battle of Waterloo. In the meantime, Napoleon had to carefully strategize. He knew that the armies of the coalition were approaching from several fronts, and he had to strike quickly to gain the upper hand. The coming battle was not just about survival for Napoleon. It was about securing his place in history. The world would soon witness the outcome of the 100 Days, and Napoleon's future hung in the balance. By the time Napoleon had rallied his forces, the situation had become increasingly tense. The Sixth Coalition, a formidable alliance of Britain, Prussia, Russia, Austria, and others, had mobilized their armies to confront Napoleon's renewed threat. In June 1815, the decisive conflict that would determine the fate of Europe and Napoleon's future took place on the fields of Waterloo, a small village in modern-day Belgium. This battle would prove to be Napoleon's final stand, and its outcome would not only seal his fate, but also shape the future of Europe. Napoleon's strategy at Waterloo was rooted in his usual boldness. His goal was to defeat the British army, commanded by the Duke of Wellington, before the Prussian forces, led by Gebhard Leberecht von Blücher, could arrive to reinforce them. He believed that with decisive action, he could destroy Wellington's forces and break the will of the British before Prussia had a chance to intervene. The battle, Napoleon hoped, would give him the momentum he needed to solidify his rule once again. On June 18, 1815, the two armies met on the battlefield. Napoleon's army, numbering around 72,000 men, faced a combined British-Dutch force of about 68,000 troops. Despite being outnumbered, Napoleon had the advantage of experienced soldiers and familiar terrain. The battle began early in the morning with a French artillery barrage, aiming to weaken Wellington's defensive positions. Napoleon's forces were able to make some initial progress, and by midday, it seemed as though they might break through Wellington's lines. However, the battle quickly became a war of attrition, with neither side gaining a decisive advantage. Wellington's troops, despite their determination, were under heavy pressure from the French. Napoleon, recognizing this, launched several strong attacks to try to collapse the British center. But Wellington, aided by his well-disciplined troops, held firm. His forces were positioned on a ridge, giving them a strong defensive position. Napoleon's artillery was ineffective against the well-entrenched British soldiers, and despite several attempts to outflank Wellington's forces, the French army found itself bogged down in intense fighting. As the battle wore on, Napoleon's hope of a quick victory began to fade. The key turning point came in the late afternoon, when the Prussian army under Blücher arrived on the battlefield. Napoleon, having underestimated the speed of the Prussian advance, now found himself facing the full might of the combined forces of the coalition. Prussian reinforcements, numbering around 50,000 men, attacked Napoleon's right flank, forcing him to fight on two fronts. This was a crucial blow to Napoleon's plans. His forces, already stretched thin and exhausted, could not withstand the pressure from both the British and the Prussians. By evening, Napoleon's army began to crumble. The French, facing overwhelming numbers and having suffered heavy losses, were forced into full retreat. Napoleon's Imperial Guard, the elite soldiers that had been his final reserve, tried desperately to hold the line, but were swept aside by the advancing forces. The battle ended in complete defeat for Napoleon, and his forces fled the field in disarray. The Battle of Waterloo on June 18, 1815 was a decisive defeat for Napoleon, signaling the end of his brief return to power during the 100 Days. As the French army collapsed under the weight of combined British and Prussian forces, Napoleon's reign was effectively over. The battle had shattered Napoleon's hopes of reclaiming his empire and securing his legacy. As his troops retreated, Napoleon himself sought refuge, fully aware that the fate of his rule had been sealed. In the aftermath of the battle, Napoleon's once unshakable authority disintegrated rapidly. His supporters, who had rallied to his banner in the hope of a glorious return to power, now saw the reality of his defeat. The French monarchy, which had been restored under Louis XVIII after Napoleon's first abdication in 1814, regained its legitimacy. The people of France, weary of endless warfare and bloodshed, began to turn their backs on their emperor, choosing stability and peace over Napoleon's unrelenting ambitions. Napoleon, realizing that his position had become untenable, tried to flee the country and escape to America, but his options were severely limited. He sought refuge with the British, hoping to find asylum, but the British government, still wary of his influence and power, refused to grant him sanctuary. Instead, the British captured him and took him aboard a British ship, where he was officially forced to abdicate for the second time on June 22, 1815. This second abdication marked the final end of Napoleon's reign. His final surrender came not on the battlefield, but through the quiet surrender of his power, and he was taken into captivity. The British authorities, unwilling to take any chances on Napoleon's future ambitions, decided to exile him to a remote, heavily guarded island, St. Helena, located in the South Atlantic Ocean, far from any significant political or military influence. The isolation of St. Helena was meant to ensure that Napoleon would never be able to escape again or pose any further threat to Europe's peace. Napoleon's exile to St. Helena was a stark contrast to the grandeur of his former reign. The island was desolate, remote, and inhospitable, a far cry from the palaces of Europe that had once been his domain. For the final 6 years of his life, Napoleon lived in relative isolation, surrounded by a small group of attendants and his personal physicians. The once powerful emperor, who had commanded armies and ruled over much of Europe, was now a prisoner in exile, far removed from the political world he had once dominated. During his time on St. Helena, Napoleon spent much of his days reflecting on his past and dictating his memoirs. He remained a figure of fascination, with people across Europe still intrigued by his rise and fall. His time in exile was marked by a slow physical decline, and he died on May 5, 1821, at the age of 51, likely due to stomach cancer, though some theories suggest he may have been poisoned. His death brought the final chapter of the Napoleonic era to a close. Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo in 1815 marked the end of one of the most dramatic chapters in European history. His downfall shattered the Napoleonic Empire, but it did not erase the profound impact he had on France and the entire continent. As Europe moved beyond the 100 Days, the political landscape shifted dramatically, but the legacy of Napoleon would continue to shape the world in ways that would outlast his reign. After Napoleon's exile to St. Helena and his death in 1821, Europe began the difficult process of rebuilding from the turmoil that had plagued it for over a decade. The Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, held in the wake of Napoleon's first abdication, had already begun to redraw the political map of Europe. The goal of the Congress was to restore the balance of power that had existed before the rise of Napoleon, ensuring that no single nation would dominate Europe as France had during his reign. The Bourbon monarchy was reinstated in France under Louis XVIII, and the boundaries of many European nations were redrawn to limit French power. The Congress of Vienna sought to create a stable and lasting peace by ensuring that France would never again become a military threat. However, the French Revolution and the Napoleonic Wars had permanently altered the political and social fabric of Europe. While the monarchs and aristocrats who had dominated European society for centuries were restored to power, the revolutionary ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity that Napoleon had spread throughout Europe could not be easily undone. The Napoleonic Code, Napoleon's legal legacy, remained influential in many European countries and in colonies around the world, continuing to promote legal equality and civil rights for decades after his fall. Napoleon's military strategies also left an indelible mark on warfare. His innovative use of artillery, rapid troop movements, and combined arms tactics transformed modern military thinking. Even though Napoleon's forces were ultimately defeated at Waterloo, his military genius inspired future generations of leaders and commanders who studied his tactics and sought to emulate his battlefield success. His influence on military doctrine remained strong well into the 19th century and beyond, particularly in the development of modern warfare. Perhaps most significantly, Napoleon's legacy laid the groundwork for the rise of nationalism in Europe. Napoleon's conquests, though often brutal, had helped spread the idea of a unified nation-state. His imposition of the Napoleonic Code and his administrative reforms helped establish the idea of modern governance and citizenship based on merit rather than aristocratic privilege. In many ways, Napoleon was both a product of the French Revolution and a catalyst for the forces that would lead to the rise of modern European nationalism. As his empire fell, the ideals of nationhood and self-determination continued to grow in power, eventually leading to the unification of Germany and Italy later in the 19th century. In France, despite the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, Napoleon's memory remained powerful. His influence endured not only among his supporters, but also in the collective consciousness of the French people, who had witnessed the heights of French power under his rule and the subsequent humiliation of defeat. His legend grew, and over time, Napoleon became a symbol of both revolutionary ideals and the dangers of unchecked ambition. Even after his death, his name continued to inspire political movements and figures, and his legacy was invoked in discussions about the role of leadership, liberty, and the nation-state. After Napoleon's second abdication in 1815 and his exile to St. Helena, Europe faced a new phase of political reconstruction. The power vacuum left by his fall prompted the restoration of the Bourbon monarchy, with Louis XVIII ascending to the French throne. The Bourbon Restoration marked the end of over a decade of revolutionary upheaval and Napoleonic rule, but the process of re-establishing a monarchical order in France was far from straightforward. The Bourbons had been displaced by the French Revolution and Napoleon's rise, but they were now tasked with restoring the old order in a nation that had been fundamentally transformed by the forces of revolution. Louis XVIII, the younger brother of the executed Louis XVI, became king, but his reign was fraught with challenges. His throne, although legitimized by the Allied powers at the Congress of Vienna, was precariously positioned. The French population was divided, with royalists who supported the monarchy and Republicans and Bonapartists who longed for the revolutionary ideals or the return of Napoleon. When Louis XVIII returned to Paris in May 1814, after Napoleon's exile, he was welcomed with cautious optimism by some, while others viewed him with suspicion. The scars of Napoleon's fall were still fresh in the minds of many French citizens, and the monarch's return was seen by some as a return to the pre-revolutionary status quo, which many had fought so hard to dismantle. To solidify his legitimacy and ease the transition, Louis XVIII made a crucial decision. He adopted a constitutional charter, effectively a charter of rights, which would guarantee certain freedoms to the people of France while maintaining the monarch's authority. This charter of 1814 promised civil liberties, such as freedom of the press, equality before the law, and the right to own property, important reforms inspired by the French Revolution. Louis XVIII recognized the necessity of modernizing France and offering a balance between monarchical power and the revolutionary ideals that had swept through the nation. While the charter was progressive for its time, it did not fully satisfy all factions. Royalists, those loyal to the Bourbon family, were disappointed that Louis XVIII did not restore the absolute monarchy of the pre-revolutionary era. Meanwhile, many liberals and revolutionaries were unhappy with the limited scope of the charter, feeling it did not go far enough to guarantee the rights and freedoms they had fought for during the revolution. These tensions between the different political groups created an uneasy atmosphere in post-Napoleonic France, where old wounds and new political realities were constantly at odds. The return of Louis XVIII to the French throne in 1814 brought the Bourbon monarchy back to power, but it also set the stage for significant political challenges. The monarchy, now re-established after the Napoleonic era, had to navigate a deeply divided France. Louis XVIII faced the daunting task of reconciling the monarchy with the political and social changes that had occurred during the French Revolution and the Napoleonic period. For some, the monarchy's return represented the restoration of the old order, while for others, it was a symbol of a repressive past that could no longer dominate the future. To address these challenges, Louis XVIII adopted a constitutional charter that sought to balance royal authority with the gains of the Revolution. The Charter of 1814 promised civil liberties, freedom of the press, and equality before the law, which were among the most significant achievements of the Revolution. By granting these rights, Louis sought to create a constitutional monarchy, one that could maintain the Bourbon family's authority while accommodating the political demands of a modern French state. However, Louis's ability to govern was hampered by the divisions within French society. The Royalist faction, which had remained loyal to the Bourbon family, demanded a return to absolutism, where the king held supreme power. These royalists felt that the constitutional charter was a compromise that undermined the monarchy's divine right and sought to preserve the social and political changes that had taken place during the French Revolution. On the other hand, liberals and former revolutionaries who had fought for democracy and republican values were wary of the return of the monarchy. They feared that the king would not honor the charter's promises and that political freedoms could be gradually rolled back. Despite these internal challenges, Louis XVIII did manage to maintain stability for a time, largely due to his more moderate and pragmatic approach. His willingness to compromise with both royalists and revolutionary factions allowed him to gain support from a broad section of French society. However, the political and social divisions within France remained a constant source of tension, and Louis struggled to gain the full support of the people. One of the key issues was the return of émigrés, royalists who had fled France during the Revolution. Many of these individuals sought to reclaim their properties, privileges, and titles that had been stripped from them during the revolutionary period. The reentry of these royalist families created an atmosphere of resentment, particularly among those who had benefited from the Revolution and the Napoleonic reforms. Many felt that the return of the monarchy meant a return to the old privileges of the aristocracy, which threatened the principles of equality that had been fought for during the Revolution. As time went on, Louis XVIII's ability to balance the old and the new began to weaken. Although he had initially promised stability, his attempts to satisfy the conflicting demands of royalists and revolutionaries ultimately proved insufficient. The Bourbon monarchy, while restored, was deeply challenged by the political climate in post-revolutionary France. The growing tension between the ultra-royalists who sought a return to the past and the liberals who demanded more reforms and political freedom created a volatile atmosphere that threatened the fragile peace in the country. As the years passed, the political landscape of France continued to shift under the rule of Louis XVIII, but one of the most significant challenges came from the growing influence of the ultras, a faction of extreme royalists who sought to completely reverse the revolutionary changes of the past and restore the monarchy to its absolute form. These ultras, led by figures like the Count of Artois, later Charles X, Louis XVIII's brother, were fervent supporters of monarchical absolutism and saw the constitutional charter as a compromise, a temporary concession that should eventually be discarded in favor of a more authoritarian form of government. The ultras were determined to see France return to the Ancien Regime, the system of absolute monarchy where the king held unchecked power, the aristocracy enjoyed special privileges, and the revolutionary reforms were rolled back. They found support among conservative nobles and the Catholic clergy, who viewed the revolutionary changes as a threat to their privileges and religious authority. The ultras believed that the French Revolution had been a disaster, and they aimed to undo the progress that had been made under Napoleon and the revolutionaries, particularly the Napoleonic Code, which had brought equality before the law and secular governance. The rise of the ultras put Louis XVIII in a difficult position. On one hand, he needed their support to secure his monarchical legitimacy and consolidate his reign. On the other hand, their demands were dangerously reactionary and conflicted with the more moderate elements of French society, who had supported his initial return to the throne. While Louis XVIII had attempted to balance his rule by adopting the constitutional charter, which granted civil liberties and recognized the gains of the Revolution, the ultras demanded more. They wanted the abolition of the charter, the restoration of feudal privileges, and the suppression of any revolutionary institutions. As the ultras gained influence, they became increasingly vocal and began to dominate the political scene. In 1816, Louis XVIII was forced to dissolve the Chamber of Deputies, the lower house of the French Parliament, due to growing opposition from more moderate factions who feared the ultras' agenda. In the subsequent elections, the ultras succeeded in securing more seats, further pushing their radical agenda. However, the ultras' demands were unpopular among many segments of French society, especially the middle class, or bourgeoisie, who had benefited from the revolutionary reforms. This group, which had prospered under Napoleon, saw the ultras as a threat to their newfound influence and wealth. They feared that a return to absolute monarchy would destroy the social and political changes that had allowed them to rise in status. The liberal bourgeoisie, along with the Republicans and former Napoleonic supporters, began to voice their opposition to the increasing power of the ultras, creating a volatile and unstable political environment. Louis XVIII found himself caught between these competing forces, the moderate royalists, who wanted to preserve a constitutional monarchy, and the ultras, who wanted to return to the old, absolutist ways. While Louis attempted to maintain a delicate balance, his inability to fully satisfy the ultras and his failure to appease the liberals contributed to his growing political weakness. The power struggle between these factions would set the stage for future conflicts within the French monarchy, eventually leading to more radical political movements. As tensions mounted, it became clear that the Bourbon monarchy was not as secure as it appeared. The rise of the ultras highlighted the fundamental division in post-revolutionary France between those who wanted to restore the old order and those who sought to preserve the revolutionary gains. This divide would only grow sharper in the years to come, culminating in the eventual downfall of Louis XVIII's successor, Charles X, and the outbreak of further revolutionary unrest in France. The political landscape of post-Napoleonic France was deeply divided, and the Bourbon monarchy under Louis XVIII found itself in a precarious position. While the ultras were pushing for a return to absolute monarchy, a large portion of French society, the bourgeoisie, liberals, and former revolutionaries, remained firmly attached to the gains made during the French Revolution and Napoleon's reign. These groups had benefited from the abolition of feudal privileges, the Napoleonic Code, and the liberalization of French society, and they were not eager to see these reforms rolled back. Louis XVIII's greatest challenge was reconciling these two opposing forces. On the one hand, the ultras demanded the restoration of the monarchy's absolute powers, and on the other, the bourgeoisie and liberals sought to preserve the political and social changes that had taken place over the previous decades. The king's decision to sign the Constitutional Charter of 1814 was a compromise designed to balance these interests, but it left both sides unsatisfied. While the charter granted civil liberties, protected property rights, and recognized some of the revolutionary gains, it did not fully restore the power of the monarchy, nor did it completely satisfy the demands for political freedom. One of the major issues was the return of émigrés, noble families who had fled France during the Revolution. Upon the king's restoration, many of these émigrés sought to reclaim their lands, titles, and privileges that had been confiscated during the Revolution. This was a deeply contentious issue, as many of the new bourgeois elites who had gained power and wealth during the Revolution felt that these properties and privileges should not be returned to the old aristocracy. The restoration of noble privileges threatened the progress made by the middle class, which had embraced the egalitarian ideals of the Revolution. For the liberals, who had witnessed the rise of Napoleon's reforms, the monarchy's return was a bitter reminder of the pre-revolutionary past. Although the charter promised certain liberties, it was clear that Louis XVIII was reluctant to fully embrace the principles of democracy. His government retained significant monarchical power, and he was cautious about allowing the kind of political freedoms that could lead to radical reforms. Many liberals feared that the Bourbons might gradually move away from constitutionalism and restore the absolute monarchy that had been so prevalent before the Revolution. The tension between royalists and liberals was heightened by the fact that France's political system was still highly unstable. The Chamber of Deputies, the lower house of Parliament, established under the Charter, was split between royalists, who supported the king's authority, and liberals, who sought more political freedoms. The royalist faction wanted to strengthen the monarchy, while the liberals pushed for greater representation and protection of the civil rights gained during the Revolution. This polarization created an environment of constant political conflict, with both sides unwilling to compromise. Adding to the instability were the ongoing economic difficulties facing post-Napoleonic France. The country was still recovering from the Napoleonic Wars, which had left it financially drained and deeply in debt. The Bourbon monarchy was forced to implement taxes that were unpopular among the people, particularly the working class and bourgeoisie, who had hoped for a more liberal economic policy. As social and economic tensions increased, the king's ability to maintain control weakened. Louis XVIII's attempts at political reconciliation were ultimately unsuccessful. The French monarchy was caught between the forces of reactionary royalism, which sought to restore the old order, and the forces of liberalism, which wanted to preserve the revolutionary gains. This struggle left the monarchy vulnerable, and the eventual succession of Charles X, Louis XVIII's brother, would further deepen the divisions in French society, setting the stage for future revolutionary unrest. Despite the challenges faced by Louis XVIII, his reign was marked by a relatively cautious approach to governance. However, his brother and successor, Charles X, would take a far more reactionary stance, leading to significant political unrest and ultimately the downfall of the Bourbon monarchy. Charles X's desire to reinstate absolute monarchy and undo the liberal reforms of the Revolution would ignite widespread protests, culminating in the July Revolution of 1830, a critical turning point in French history. Upon Louis XVIII's death in 1824, Charles X ascended to the throne. A staunch royalist, he believed in the divine right of kings and sought to restore the old order that had been overthrown during the Revolution. Charles's policies quickly alienated many segments of French society, especially the liberals, bourgeoisie, and middle class, who had benefited from the more moderate approach of his brother. His efforts to roll back the liberal gains of the Revolution, such as reinstating the privileges of the nobility and curbing the influence of the middle class, angered those who had hoped for a more balanced and progressive monarchy. Charles X's most infamous decision was the July Ordinances of 1830, a series of decrees that dissolved the Chamber of Deputies, restricted the press, and changed the electoral system to favor royalist interests. These actions were seen as a blatant attempt to reassert absolute monarchy and strip away the civil liberties guaranteed by the Charter of 1814. The July Ordinances sparked an immediate backlash from the French public, particularly from the liberals and the growing bourgeois class, who viewed Charles's actions as a direct assault on the constitutional charter and the freedoms they had fought to preserve. The French people, who had already experienced the trauma of Revolution and Napoleon's reign, were unwilling to return to the old regime of absolute monarchy. Over the course of 3 days, from July 27 to 29, 1830, a wave of protests and riots erupted in Paris, which became known as the July Revolution. The workers, students, and middle class took to the streets in defiance of Charles X's increasingly repressive measures. Barricades went up across the city, and the fighting was fierce, with both sides suffering significant casualties. The revolutionaries were fueled by the hope of reform and the desire for political freedom, while Charles X's supporters struggled to maintain control of the capital. As the revolution unfolded, Charles X's regime collapsed. The king, realizing that his support had evaporated, abdicated the throne on August 2, 1830, in favor of his grandson, the Duke of Bordeaux, though it was too late. The July Revolution had irrevocably dismantled the Bourbon monarchy's rule. Charles X fled to exile in England, and the French people declared the monarchy vacant. The Bourbon Restoration came to a dramatic end with the ascent of Louis Philippe to the throne. Known as the Citizen King, Louis Philippe was chosen by the French people and their representatives as the new monarch. He was seen as a more moderate figure who could bridge the gap between the revolutionary ideals of the past and the monarchical tradition of France. His reign, known as the July Monarchy, marked a shift toward constitutional monarchy with a greater emphasis on bourgeois interests. The July Revolution of 1830 was a pivotal moment in French history. It signaled the end of the Bourbon monarchy, which had been re-established after Napoleon's fall, and the beginning of a new political order. Though Louis Philippe's reign would not be without its own challenges, the July Revolution marked the end of absolute monarchy in France and the rise of a more liberal and bourgeois form of governance, one that would continue to evolve throughout the 19th century. One of the most enduring legacies of Napoleon Bonaparte is his Napoleonic Code, a legal framework that radically transformed the legal systems of France and many other nations. The Code Civil, as it is officially known, was implemented in 1804 and became the foundation for legal systems in many parts of Europe and beyond. Napoleon's genius in creating this code lay in his ability to distill the revolutionary ideals of equality and liberty into a practical legal system. The Napoleonic Code abolished feudal privileges, ensuring that all citizens, regardless of their social class, were equal before the law. It provided property rights, guaranteed civil liberties, and established clear rules for family law, contract law, and criminal law. By creating a uniform set of laws, Napoleon removed the inconsistencies that existed in the many legal systems across France's territories, thus consolidating his power and providing stability to the countries he conquered. Napoleon's code was groundbreaking for its time, as it promoted secular governance and legal equality, which were essential for a modern state. It influenced legal systems in countries like Italy, Spain, Belgium, and Germany, as well as former colonies in Latin America. Even after Napoleon's fall, his legal reforms lived on, with many of the principles in the Napoleonic Code still present in legal systems around the world today. While the code was a triumph in terms of legal reform, it also limited women's rights, reinforcing their role within the traditional family structure. Nevertheless, the Napoleonic Code remains one of Napoleon's most important contributions to the modern world. Another profound legacy of Napoleon's empire was the spread of nationalism across Europe. While Napoleon's conquests were initially driven by military ambitions and the desire to create a unified Europe under French control, his campaigns unintentionally ignited the flames of nationalism in the countries he occupied. Before Napoleon, Europe was largely divided into small, fragmented states, often ruled by foreign monarchies or the remnants of medieval power structures. However, Napoleon's military domination of much of Europe created a new sense of identity for many regions. As he dismantled old institutions and imposed French-style reforms, local populations began to develop a shared identity and a desire for self-determination. In countries like Germany, Italy, and Poland, Napoleon's rule laid the groundwork for later nationalist movements. Napoleon's Confederation of the Rhine united German states under French control, fostering a sense of common interest among them. In Italy, Napoleon's creation of kingdoms and client states encouraged the idea of a unified Italian identity, which would later inspire the Italian unification movement. In Poland, Napoleon's creation of the Duchy of Warsaw rekindled Polish aspirations for independence, which would eventually lead to the restoration of Poland in the 20th century. Although Napoleon's empire was eventually dismantled after his defeat, the idea of nationalism, the belief in the power and importance of the nation-state, had taken root. The wars Napoleon waged, and the political and social changes he enacted, created the conditions for the rise of modern nation-states. The ideals of national sovereignty and self-governance continued to evolve throughout the 19th century, culminating in the unification of Germany and Italy, and contributing to the breakup of empires like the Austrian and Ottoman empires. Napoleon Bonaparte's influence on modern warfare cannot be overstated. His innovations in military strategy and tactics revolutionized the art of war, and many of the principles he implemented continue to shape military doctrine today. Napoleon's success on the battlefield was not merely due to his brilliant leadership or his strong will. It was his ability to adapt and innovate that set him apart. One of Napoleon's key innovations was his use of mass conscription, often referred to as the levy en masse. In contrast to previous armies that relied on small, professional forces, Napoleon called upon the entire population of France to supply troops. This allowed him to raise massive armies, often numbering in the hundreds of thousands, which could quickly mobilize and sustain campaigns across Europe. The idea of a national army, composed of soldiers from all walks of life, became a model that would influence military organizations throughout the 19th and 20th centuries. Another key element of Napoleon's military legacy was his mastery of mobile warfare. Napoleon was a master of maneuver warfare, using the art of speed to outflank and surprise his opponents. He would often march his armies great distances, rapidly shifting them to different points on the battlefield, catching the enemy off guard. His use of corps, independent, self-sustaining units, allowed him to maintain flexibility and respond to changing situations with speed and precision. These tactics were a precursor to modern blitzkrieg tactics, employed by Germany in the early 20th century. Napoleon also revolutionized artillery by integrating it into his infantry and cavalry, rather than treating it as a separate, stationary force. He understood the power of artillery to break enemy lines, and he employed it to devastating effect, often using it to destroy fortified positions or to support attacks by his infantry. His focus on combined arms, the coordination of infantry, cavalry, and artillery, became a cornerstone of modern military strategy. Moreover, Napoleon's battlefield logistics were ahead of his time. He established efficient supply chains and systems for maintaining the mobility of his forces, which allowed his army to operate deep in enemy territory. His ability to move large forces rapidly, supply them efficiently, and ensure their readiness in harsh conditions became a model for future military campaigns. Even though Napoleon's empire eventually crumbled, his military innovations continued to influence military leaders long after his reign. His legacy can be seen in the development of modern armies, the importance of speed and maneuver in warfare, and the integration of different branches of the military into a cohesive force capable of achieving strategic objectives. Beyond his impact on law and warfare, Napoleon Bonaparte also left a lasting mark on education and civil administration across France and many of the territories he conquered. Napoleon was acutely aware that administrative efficiency and education were key to creating a stable and powerful state. His reforms in both areas shaped the modern state and laid the groundwork for much of the organizational structure seen in European nations today. One of Napoleon's most notable contributions was his overhaul of the education system. Recognizing that education was essential for both civic virtue and economic development, he introduced a system of state-controlled schools aimed at providing a uniform education for all citizens, regardless of their social background. Under his rule, secondary schools, known as lycées, were established across France, designed to educate the future leaders and administrators of the empire. These schools focused on rigorous academic training in subjects such as mathematics, science, and literature, preparing students for careers in both the military and civil service. Napoleon also created the University of France in 1808, an institution designed to oversee all public education in France. This centralized system ensured that education was aligned with the needs of the state, producing a well-trained bureaucracy that could efficiently manage the vast empire Napoleon had created. His education reforms not only helped shape the French civil service, but also provided a model for other countries in Europe, many of which later adopted similar systems. In addition to education, Napoleon implemented sweeping changes to the civil administration of France and the territories he controlled. One of his most lasting legacies in this area was his creation of an efficient, centralized bureaucracy. Before his reign, local authorities in France were often weak and fragmented, and Napoleon sought to replace this patchwork system with a more cohesive and professional administration. He divided France into departments, each overseen by an appointed prefect, who was responsible for maintaining order, collecting taxes, and enforcing the law. This centralized system of governance brought much-needed stability and efficiency to the state, and it would later be adopted by many countries in Europe. Napoleon also revolutionized public works in France. His reign saw the construction of roads, bridges, and canals, which facilitated trade and communication throughout France. His emphasis on infrastructure not only supported his military campaigns, but also contributed to the economic growth of France in the 19th century. While Napoleon's political and military legacy is often the most discussed, his reforms in education and administration were equally significant. They helped shape the modern state and influenced the development of centralized governments and civil service systems across Europe. Even after Napoleon's fall, many of his institutional reforms lived on, providing the foundation for the modern bureaucratic state we recognize today. While Napoleon's military conquests and empire building ultimately ended in defeat, his legacy in shaping the political landscape of Europe was profound. Napoleon's influence not only reshaped the borders of the continent, but also planted the seeds for the rise of nationalism and the eventual breakup of empires. His rule contributed to the decline of the old monarchies, and his ideas inspired political movements that would alter the course of European history long after his fall. One of Napoleon's most significant political legacies was the spread of nationalism. As he conquered much of Europe, Napoleon's rule unintentionally fostered a sense of national unity in many regions. While he imposed French laws, institutions, and culture on the territories he controlled, he also stirred the national consciousness of the people living under his empire. In areas like Germany, Italy, and Poland, Napoleon's reorganization of territories, such as the creation of the Confederation of the Rhine and his establishment of client states, ignited the idea of a unified nation-state. This sense of national identity would later fuel the unification movements in Germany and Italy in the 19th century. Napoleon's spread of nationalist sentiments across Europe also contributed to the eventual downfall of empires. As the ideas of self-determination and sovereignty took root, the old, multi-ethnic empires, like the Austrian and Ottoman empires, began to face increasing demands for independence from their diverse populations. This shift in political thinking contributed to the erosion of these imperial structures and the rise of independent nation-states across Europe. In particular, Napoleon's reign is often seen as a precursor to the political upheavals and revolutions of the 19th century, including the revolutions of 1848 that swept across Europe. The Congress of Vienna, 1814 to 1815, which sought to restore the European order after Napoleon's defeat, aimed to reinstate the old monarchies and suppress revolutionary ideals. However, Napoleon's influence could not be undone. The nationalist movements he had unwittingly encouraged could not be contained, and they eventually led to the formation of a more modern political landscape in Europe. Even though the Congress of Vienna redrew borders and attempted to restore conservative rule, the forces of nationalism were already at play, and Napoleon's legacy of nation-building continued to inspire European politics for generations to come. In the decades after Napoleon's defeat, his empire may have collapsed, but his political ideas and the social changes he initiated would continue to shape Europe. Napoleon's emphasis on the nation-state, the spread of legal equality, and the idea of self-determination influenced political thinkers, revolutionaries, and reformers throughout the 19th century. Even the French Revolution and Napoleon's rule, though they brought about significant turmoil, were steps toward a more modern, democratic Europe. Thus, Napoleon's legacy lives on in the nationalist movements that shaped the rise of modern nation-states, in the decline of empires, and the political changes that ultimately laid the groundwork for the European political system we recognize today. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed exploring history with us, don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more captivating stories. At Past to Pillow, we bring history to life, making it the perfect companion for a restful sleep. Drop your thoughts or suggestions below.